The house at the end of Penance Lane had always been a myth. People whispered about it in the way small towns do, weaving half-truths into ghost stories to pass the time. They said it was cursed, that anyone who went inside didn't come back the same. Or didn't come back at all. Kids dared each other to touch its front gate, to knock on the peeling door, but no one ever stayed long. I never thought much about it until I inherited the place. It came out of nowhere. A cryptic letter from a lawyer saying a distant relative I'd never heard of had left me the property. I almost didn't go. The house was states away, in a town I hadn't visited since childhood. But curiosity has a way of unraveling your better judgment. When I arrived, the house was worse than I'd imagined. It stood at the end of the lane, shrouded by gnarled trees that cast jagged shadows over its decaying facade. The windows were blacked out, the roof sagging under years of neglect. But the most unsettling thing was the silence. No birds, no wind, no distant hum of life. Just stillness. The front gate was rusted shut, but it gave way with a groan when I pushed hard enough. As I stepped onto the cracked walkway, I noticed something odd. The air smelled faintly sweet, like overripe fruit. The key the lawyer sent slid into the lock easily, and the door swung open on silent hinges. Inside, the house was untouched. Dust coated the floors and furniture, but everything else was pristine, like the occupants had left mid-step. A half-empty teacup sat on the coffee table. A pair of shoes rested neatly by the door. I wandered through the rooms, my footsteps muffled by thick rugs. Each space felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself pressed against my skin. The walls were lined with mirrors, their frames ornate and mismatched, reflecting the dim light in strange, distorted ways. One mirror caught my attention. It was larger than the others, nearly floor to ceiling, with a frame carved to resemble twisting vines. Unlike the rest, its surface wasn't clouded by dust. As I stared at it, I realized my reflection didn't quite match my movements. I raised my hand. My reflection followed, but just a fraction of a second too late. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I told myself I was imagining it, that the house, the myths, the weight of being alone in a strange place were playing tricks on me. I turned away, but the sensation of being watched lingered. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was silent, but it wasn't the comforting silence of solitude. It was the silence of anticipation, like the house itself was holding its breath. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. A soft creak, like a footstep on old wood. It came from downstairs, faint but deliberate. I sat up, straining to listen, my heart pounding in my ears. Another creak, and another. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and crept down the stairs, each step agonizingly loud in the stillness. When I reached the living room, I swept the beam across the space. Nothing, but the large mirror was different. The reflection didn't match the room anymore. It showed the same space, the same furniture, but it was wrong. The shadows were deeper, the corners darker, and in the center of the room stood a figure. It wasn't me. The figure was tall and thin, its features obscured by the murky reflection. It didn't move, didn't react, but I could feel its attention, sharp and focused, like a blade pressed against my skin. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. When I looked again, the mirror was empty, reflecting only the room as it should have been. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I was ready to leave. I didn't care about the inheritance, or the house, or the mystery. I packed my bag, intent on getting as far from Penance Lane as possible. But as I reached for the front door, I froze. The mirrors were all different now. Each one showed a reflection that didn't match the room. In one, the furniture was rearranged. In another, the windows were cracked and broken, sunlight streaming through jagged holes. And in the largest mirror, the one with the vine-like frame, the figure was back. Closer this time. Its hand was pressed against the glass. Long fingers splayed out as though it were trying to push through. The door wouldn't open. No matter how hard I pulled, the lock wouldn't budge. I grabbed a chair and swung it at the window, but the glass didn't even crack. Behind me, the mirrors began to hum. It was a low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, growing louder until it filled my skull. The reflection in the vine-framed mirror moved closer, its hand pressing harder against the glass. Cracks began to spread outward, spiderwebbing across the surface. I ran. I bolted up the stairs, down the hallway, into a room I hadn't explored yet. It was empty except for a single mirror, smaller than the others, leaning against the wall. Its reflection was clear, perfect, but there was no door behind me in the reflection, just a blank wall. I turned around, and the door was gone. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor, through my bones. The small mirror's reflection began to change, the walls warping, the floor shifting, until it showed a space I didn't recognize. A hand appeared in the corner of the mirror, not mine, and then, slowly, it reached through. When I woke, I was lying on the floor of the living room. The mirrors were gone. The house was silent again, but the air felt heavier than ever, pressing against my chest with every breath. The front door was open, swinging gently in the breeze. I didn't look back as I ran to my car and drove away. But sometimes, when I catch my reflection in the bathroom mirror or the storefront window, I see it, just for a moment. The figure, closer now. I rented the room above the bookstore because it was cheap, and I was desperate. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Carr, handed me the key with a half-smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're quiet, aren't you?" she asked, her voice low and brittle, like dried leaves. "Quiet is good." I nodded, though I didn't fully understand what she meant. The room itself was unremarkable. A twin bed pushed against one wall, a rickety desk under the window, and a closet so small it barely counted as one. The paint on the walls was peeling in places, revealing a layer of pale green beneath the beige, and the single bulb overhead buzzed faintly when turned on. What sold me on it wasn't the room but the bookstore below. Mrs. Carr's shop was a maze of narrow aisles and sagging shelves, the kind of place where the scent of old paper and dust hung heavy in the air. It felt timeless, as if it existed just slightly out of sync with the rest of the world. Some shelves are best left alone. Mrs. Carr had warned me the day I moved in. She gestured to a corner of the store where the books seemed older, the spines worn smooth and the titles faded. They have a way of drawing people in. Better to leave them be. I didn't argue. For the first few nights, I barely noticed the room's quirks. The faint creak of the floorboards, the occasional groan of the pipes, the way the light from the street lamp outside cast long, uneven shadows across the walls. I told myself it was just an old building settling, nothing to worry about. But then the books started appearing. At first, I thought Mrs. Carr had left them as a kind gesture, a way to welcome me. They'd show up on the desk or the windowsill, their covers pristine despite the age of the store below. Titles I didn't recognize. The River That Swallowed Stars, Echoes of the Hollow Sky, The House Without Corners. I flipped through the first one absent-mindedly, expecting dense, outdated prose. Instead, I found pages filled with sharp, angular handwriting, like the words had been carved into the paper rather than written. The text didn't make sense, jumping from fragmented descriptions to lists of strange symbols. I skimmed a few pages before closing it, a faint unease curling in my stomach. By the fourth night, I had a small stack of them. I tried asking Mrs. Carr about the books, but she just shook her head. "You don't have to read them," she said, her tone curt. "They'll leave you alone if you leave them alone." I didn't tell her I'd already started reading. The books weren't like anything I'd ever encountered. They didn't tell stories, not in the way I understood stories to work. Instead, they felt like glimpses into other places, worlds layered just beneath our own. One described a city where the buildings were alive, their windows blinking like eyes, their streets shifting underfoot. Another detailed a forest that grew in reverse, the trees shrinking into the ground until only their roots remained. And then there was the book I found on my pillow. I hadn't touched it, not at first. Its cover was blank, save for a faint impression of something circular, like the imprint of a seal. When I finally opened it, the pages were filled with a single repeating sentence, written in my own handwriting. "You are not alone." That night, the shadows in my room began to move. I first noticed it just after midnight. The shape of the street lamp's light against the wall seemed to ripple, as though something had passed in front of it. But when I looked out the window, the street below was empty. The shadows didn't stay on the walls. They stretched toward me, long and deliberate, curling across the floor like fingers. I told myself it was a trick of the light, but when one brushed against my hand, the coldness of it made me flinch. I tried sleeping with the light on after that, but it didn't help. The bulb overhead flickered constantly, dimming just enough to let the shadows creep closer. The next morning, Mrs. Carr was waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs. "You opened one, didn't you?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. I nodded, unable to lie. Her expression darkened. "They know you now. The best you can do is ignore them. Don't read anymore, and for God's sake, don't write." I didn't ask her what she meant. That evening, the shadows returned, stronger than before. They no longer needed the light to move. I watched, paralyzed, as they pooled in the corners of the room, forming shapes that were almost human but not quite. When I turned to the desk, there was another book waiting for me. This one was different. Its cover was black, its edges bound with thin, silver thread. The pages were blank at first, but as I flipped through, words began to appear, scrawled in the same sharp handwriting as the others. "Write it down." The sentence repeated, over and over, until it filled every page. I tried throwing the book away. I carried it down to the alley behind the store, hurling it into the dumpster with shaking hands. But when I returned to my room, it was back on the desk, its cover pristine. The next night, I woke to find the book open on my lap, a pen in my hand. I didn't remember picking it up. The shadows crowded around me, their shapes flickering at the edges like dying flames. They didn't touch me, not directly, but their presence pressed against my chest, heavy and suffocating. I began to write. At first, it was nonsense, strings of words and symbols that spilled from my hand without thought. But the more I wrote, the more it began to feel familiar. Like the words weren't coming from me, but through me. The shadows receded as the pages filled, their forms dissolving into the corners of the room. When I finally stopped, the book felt heavier, its spine bulging with the weight of what I'd written. I closed it carefully, placing it back on the desk. The room was quiet after that. The book stopped appearing. The shadows stayed still. Even Mrs. Carr seemed lighter, her glances less guarded. But the black book remained on the desk, untouched, its silver binding gleaming faintly in the lamplight. I don't know what I wrote. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I pass the corner of the bookstore where the oldest shelves stand, I feel the shadows shift, just slightly, and I know they're waiting for me to write again. The day my reflection began acting on its own was the day I stopped feeling real. It happened while I was brushing my teeth, staring absent-mindedly into the bathroom mirror. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The same face I saw every day, half lit by the harsh fluorescent bulb overhead. Tired eyes, unkempt hair, a faint scar across my chin from a childhood accident. I wasn't paying attention, not really. But when I bent down to rinse my mouth, my reflection didn't move. I froze, the cool water dribbling from my lips into the sink. Slowly, I straightened, expecting the mirror to catch up. It didn't. My reflection stood stock still, head tilted slightly to the left, watching me with a look I didn't recognize. I backed away, nearly tripping over the bath mat, my heart pounding in my chest. As I moved, the reflection began to follow, delayed and jerky, like a poorly synced video. When I turned off the light and shut the door, I could still feel its eyes on me through the wood. That night, I tried to sleep, but my mind refused to quiet. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. My reflection's strange expression, its head cocked like it was trying to understand me. The next morning, the mirror seemed normal again. My reflection moved as I did, the same tired face staring back at me. I told myself I'd imagined it, that I was overtired, maybe even dreaming. Still, I avoided looking at it longer than I had to. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't just the bathroom mirror. It was every reflective surface, the blank screen of my TV, the glass covering an old photograph on my desk, even the faint sheen of my car's windows. No matter where I looked, I felt its presence just beyond the surface, waiting. And then, the noises began. At first, it was faint. A soft creak from the bathroom late at night, the quiet tap of something against glass. I told myself it was the house settling, the wind rattling the old windows. But the noises grew louder, more deliberate. One evening, as I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone, I heard it, a faint scratching sound, rhythmic and insistent. It was coming from the bathroom. I didn't want to go in. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away, to lock the door and leave the house entirely. But something pulled me forward. The bathroom was dark, the light switched cold under my fingers. When the bulb flickered on, the scratching stopped. The mirror was empty, my reflection staring back at me like it always had. For a moment, I felt foolish, but then I noticed the words. They were faint, written in the foggy residue left by a dozen showers. For simple words, scrawled in uneven letters. Let me come through. I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the tile, and fled the room. The next day, the mirror was clean, as if the message had never been there. But the feeling of being watched was sharper now, more focused. At work, I caught glimpses of myself in the computer screen, my reflection watching me with an intensity that didn't feel like mine. When I passed a shop window on my way home, I saw myself standing still while I kept walking. That night, I covered every mirror in the house. I taped towels and bed sheets over them, the fabric hanging limp and lifeless. It didn't help. The scratching returned, louder now, echoing through the empty rooms. I lay awake, the sound crawling under my skin, and for the first time, I wondered if I was losing my mind. The next morning, the covers were gone. I don't know how it happened. The towels and sheets were folded neatly at the foot of my bed, as if someone had carefully removed them while I slept. The mirrors were exposed again, gleaming in the soft morning light. My reflection smiled at me as I stumbled into the bathroom, but I wasn't smiling. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The reflection tilted its head, just slightly. The scratching grew worse after that. It came not just from the bathroom, but from every corner of the house. The walls, the windows, even the floorboards groaned and creaked with a rhythm that seemed to mimic the beating of my heart. And then it came. I woke to the sound of shattering glass, my chest tight with panic. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of something metallic. I stumbled into the hallway, my feet crunching over shards of mirror scattered across the floor. Every mirror in the house was broken. I froze, staring at the largest fragment. My reflection stared back, whole and unbroken, though the glass was jagged and cracked. It smiled again. "You broke them," it said, its voice faint but clear, as if coming from a great distance. I couldn't breathe. What do you want?" It didn't answer. Instead, it raised its hand, pressing its palm flat against the surface of the broken shard. I felt a sudden pressure in my chest, as if something was pulling me forward, drawing me toward the glass. "Let me come through," it whispered again, its voice soft and steady. I ran. I left the house that night, drove until the city faded into the distance, until the dark highway stretched endlessly before me. But the mirrors didn't stay behind. In the motel room where I stopped, the bathroom mirror was intact, its surface pristine. When I looked into it, my reflection was waiting, its smile sharper now, its eyes darker. "Where will you go?" it asked, tilting its head in that same familiar way. I smashed the mirror with the heel of my hand, the glass cutting deep into my palm. Blood dripped onto the counter, but the reflection didn't shatter. It stayed whole, watching me through the cracks. "You can't escape," it said, its voice filled with quiet certainty. "You invited me in. I don't know how it will end. I've covered every reflective surface I can find, but it doesn't matter. I see it in the shadows, in the glint of light on water, in the edges of my vision when I close my eyes. And every time, it smiles." When the old man knocked on my door, I almost didn't answer. I'd been working late, a pile of revisions on my laptop, and the idea of talking to anyone, especially a stranger, felt like a burden I couldn't bear. But the knocking didn't stop. Steady, deliberate, not impatient, just insistent. I opened the door halfway, my hand gripping the edge, ready to apologize and shut it again quickly. He stood there in a long gray coat, his thin frame hunched slightly as though he were carrying some invisible weight. His face was pale, weathered and sharp, his cheekbones jutting out like a warning. His eyes, though, those were impossible to ignore. Pale gray and depthless, they looked straight through me, as if I wasn't there at all. "Can I help you?" I asked, though my voice was smaller than I intended. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, rectangular box. It was wooden, polished to a soft sheen, the edges worn smooth. He held it out to me without a word. "I think you've got the wrong." "It's yours now," he interrupted, his voice low and flat. "Do not open it until you are alone, and do not lose it." I stared at the box, unwilling to take it, but his hand didn't waver. His eyes never left mine, and something in his gaze pinned me there, still and silent. Finally, I reached out. The box was warm, far warmer than it should have been, as though it had been sitting near a fire. Before I could ask any of the questions swirling in my mind, the man turned and walked away. "Wait," I called after him, stepping onto the porch. But the street was empty. No sign of him. No sound of retreating footsteps. The box sat heavy in my hand. I went back inside, locking the door behind me, and set it on the kitchen table. It was simple, unadorned, the only feature a small latch on the front. When I touched the latch, my fingers tingled, as though the wood were vibrating faintly. The old man's words echoed in my mind. "Do not open it until you are alone." I waited until night fell, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I turned off the lights, lit a candle for no reason I could explain, and sat in front of the box. The latch clicked open easily, the sound sharp in the stillness. Inside was a key. It wasn't ornate or special, just a plain iron key, slightly rusted around the edges. It rested on a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and soft to the touch. I unfolded the paper carefully, my hands trembling, and read the single line written there. "Do not leave the door open." I frowned, turning the key over in my hand. It didn't look familiar, and I didn't know of any locked doors in the house. And then I heard it, a soft creak, faint but unmistakable, coming from upstairs. I froze, the key slipping from my fingers onto the table. The sound came again, louder this time. A door opening. I hadn't left any doors open. The floorboards groaned under my feet as I climbed the stairs, each step slower than the last. The hallway was dark, but I could see it. The door to the guest room at the far end, swinging gently on its hinges. It shouldn't have been open. I hadn't been in there for months. My pulse thundered in my ears as I approached, the shadows in the room stretching toward me as though reaching for my feet. I gripped the doorframe, heart pounding, and peered inside. The room was empty, but on the far wall, where there should have been nothing but plaster, there was a door. It didn't belong. The wood was old and dark, the surface carved with intricate symbols I couldn't begin to decipher. The handle was brass, tarnished and cold. The key in my hand felt heavier now, pulling toward the door like a magnet. I don't know why I unlocked it. Maybe I thought it would make the room feel less wrong. Maybe I thought it would end the strangeness. The door opened silently, the space beyond it dark and infinite. I stepped through before I realized what I was doing. The air inside was thick, electric, crackling faintly with a low, constant hum. The ground beneath my feet wasn't solid. It felt like walking on water that didn't ripple. Shapes moved in the distance, faint and indistinct. Shadows without sources. The space stretched endlessly in every direction. The only light coming from the faint glow of the symbols etched into the door behind me. And then it slammed shut. The hum grew louder, and the shadows began to move closer. Not walking, not running, just shifting, as though they were sliding through the air itself. A voice whispered behind me, "You left the door open." I turned, but there was no one there. The symbols on the door began to fade, their glow dimming until they disappeared entirely. The door itself dissolved, leaving me alone in the endless, humming dark. The shadows reached me, their shapes curling around my feet, my arms, my chest. They weren't cold or hot, but their weight pressed against me, tightening slowly. The whisper came again, louder this time, and I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside my mind. "You left the door open." When I woke, I was back at the kitchen table. The box was gone, but the door in the guest room was still there, closed this time, its edges glowing faintly in the darkness, and I can still hear the hum. The house at 63 Ravenwood Avenue was not haunted, not in the conventional sense. It wasn't draped in cobwebs or marked by creaking floorboards, nor did shadows dance where they shouldn't. The paint was fresh, the lawn neatly trimmed, and the windows gleamed like polished eyes. It was a house that begged no questions, demanded no attention, and yet, no one stayed. Families moved in with smiles and aspirations, unpacking boxes filled with fragile dreams. Within months, sometimes weeks, they were gone. The "for sale" sign would reappear on the lawn, its letters bold against the pristine backdrop, a punctuation mark in a story no one told. I noticed because I lived across the street. Every morning, I'd watch from my window as the house went through its silent rituals. Blinds opening and closing in unison, lights flicking on at precise intervals, the faint sound of water running as if the house were practicing the rhythm of life. It wasn't strange at first, just meticulous. But when the Harringtons left in the middle of the night, their car packed haphazardly with luggage, I began to wonder. No one else seemed to notice. The neighborhood thrived with the ordinary busyness of suburbia. Barbecues, PTA meetings, children racing bicycles down the cul-de-sac. But 63 Ravenwood was different. It existed quietly, carefully, like it didn't want to be seen too clearly. By the time the seventh family moved out, my curiosity had hardened into resolve. I called the real estate agent posing as a buyer. It wasn't difficult. The woman on the other end of the line was cheerful and accommodating, eager to schedule a viewing. The house welcomed me with open doors. Literally. The front door stood ajar when I arrived, though no one was waiting to greet me. The agent was nowhere to be found, but I stepped inside anyway. It smelled faintly of lemons, clean and sharp, as if the air had been scrubbed free of dust and memory. The rooms were bright, sterile, devoid of the warmth furniture usually lends. Even so, I felt watched. The kitchen was immaculate, its counters gleaming, its appliances lined up like soldiers. A faint ticking sound drew me to the hallway, where I found an old clock mounted on the wall. It was antique, the kind with brass hands and Roman numerals, but it wasn't keeping time. The hands twitched in tiny, repetitive motions, unable to complete their circuits. That's when I realized the house was silent. Not quiet, silent. No hum of electricity, no distant creak of settling beams, no ambient noise to fill the void. And then it spoke. Not with words, not with sound. It was a feeling, a pulse, a vibration that hummed through the soles of my feet. The house was the where. "Hello?" I said, the word absurdly loud in the vacuum of silence. The pulse quickened, a faint rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I should have left then, but instead, I climbed the stairs. The second floor was no different. Clean, empty, perfect. The bedroom doors stood open, revealing spaces that felt too neatly arranged, like hotel rooms waiting for temporary occupants. Only one door was closed. I approached it slowly, the pulse growing stronger with each step. My fingers hesitated on the knob, the cold metal biting into my skin. When I pushed the door open, I understood why no one stayed. The room wasn't empty. It was full, not of furniture, but of things. Objects I recognized, photographs, toys, books, clothing, arranged in precise rows. They weren't mine, but they could have been. A school photo of a girl with dark hair tied in a ribbon. A book I'd read 100 times as a child. A pair of sneakers scuffed at the toes. It was my life, cataloged and displayed like an exhibit. I stepped inside, my breath shallow, my chest tight. The pulse became a roar, a vibration so intense it blurred the edges of my vision. I turned, and there it was. A mirror. It hung on the far wall, its frame ornate and golden, out of place in the sterile room. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't a perfect match. The face in the glass was pale, its eyes wide and unblinking, its expression blank. "Who are you?" I whispered. The reflection tilted its head, the movement unnatural, mechanical. Its mouth moved, but no sound came out. And then it smiled. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of the carpet. The pulse became deafening, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated in my bones. Leave. The word wasn't spoken. It was felt, pressed into my mind with a force that made me stagger. I ran. Down the stairs, through the kitchen, out the front door. I didn't stop until I reached my house, slamming the door behind me and locking it with shaking hands. From my window, I could see the house. Its blinds were open, its windows glowing faintly. It looked no different than before, ordinary and unassuming, but I knew better. The next morning, the for sale sign was gone. A moving truck pulled into the driveway, and a new family began unloading their belongings. I didn't warn them. I couldn't. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt it again, the pulse, faint but familiar, vibrating through the floorboards, seeping into my bones. The house wasn't haunted. It was hungry, and now it was watching me. There's a place in the woods my grandfather always told me never to go. He called it the Fold. As a kid, I thought it was just another one of his stories. He was full of them, tales about cursed ponds and ghostly figures in the trees. They were meant to keep me from wandering too far from the house. But the Fold was different. He never spoke about it with the same playful smirk as the other stories. When he mentioned it, his voice would drop and his eyes would lose focus, like he was staring at something far away. "Don't ever go near the Fold," he'd say. "It's not a place for people like us." I didn't understand what he meant by people like us, but I nodded and stayed close to home. Years later, when my grandfather passed and left me the house, I found myself back in those woods. The property hadn't been maintained for years, and the forest had crept closer, swallowing the old trails I used to run down as a kid. I didn't plan to stay long, just enough to clean up the place and decide what to do with it. On my second day there, I found the map. It was tucked into an old, leather-bound journal in my grandfather's desk. The paper was yellowed and soft, the edges frayed. Hand-drawn lines marked the woods behind the house, along with familiar landmarks. The creek, the old oak tree, the clearing where we used to set up the hammock. But there was something else. In the farthest corner of the map, beyond anything I remembered exploring as a child, was a circle. Written inside, in my grandfather's sharp, precise handwriting, were the words, "The Fold, stay out." I stared at it for a long time, feeling that childhood unease creep back into my chest. The next morning, I decided to find it. The hike was harder than I expected. The forest had changed, grown denser, and the trails were barely visible beneath years of leaves and overgrowth. The air felt heavier the deeper I went, as though the trees were pressing in around me. An hour passed, then another. I nearly turned back twice, but curiosity drove me forward. When I finally reached the spot marked on the map, it wasn't what I expected. The Fold wasn't a clearing or a structure. It was nothing, an absence. The trees around the circle seemed to lean away from it, their branches bare and twisted. The ground was gray and barren, no grass or leaves, just cracked earth that didn't look like it belonged in this part of the forest. And in the center of the circle, the air shimmered. It reminded me of heat waves on asphalt, distorted, almost liquid. I should have left. Every part of me screamed to turn around, to leave the woods and never come back. But I stepped closer, drawn by something I couldn't name. The shimmer moved as I approached, bending and twisting, and for a moment, I thought I saw something beyond it. Not the forest, but a place with tall, dark spires and a sky that bled colors I didn't recognize. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, like someone whispering directly into my ear. "Come closer." I froze. The voice didn't sound human. It was too smooth, too steady, and it carried an undercurrent of something deep, like a hum at the edge of hearing. "You've already seen it," it said. "You might as well step through." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My feet slid forward, slow and deliberate, as though I was being pulled. The shimmer grew brighter, and the world around me dimmed. Then, just as my hand reached the edge of the Fold, I heard another voice, faint but familiar. "Stop." It was my grandfather's voice. I stumbled back, the spell broken, and fell to the ground. The shimmer pulsed, rippling like water, and I saw a figure standing on the other side. It wasn't human. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. Its face, or what should have been a face, was smooth and featureless, but its presence radiated malice. The thing raised a hand, pointing at me, and I felt a pull so strong it made my chest ache. But before it could step through, the shimmer collapsed. The fold folded in on itself, shrinking into nothingness. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the barren ground where the shimmer had been. The air was still and silent, the trees around me unmoving. When I finally made it back to the house, I found the map sitting on the kitchen table, though I was sure I'd left it in the desk. The circle marking the fold was gone. That night, I dreamt of the spires, of the thing on the other side, and of my grandfather standing between me and it, his face grim. When I woke, the journal was open on the desk, a single line written in my grandfather's handwriting. "It knows you now." I left the house that day. Sometimes, late at night, I feel the pull again. The faint hum, the shimmering air at the edge of my vision. The fold may have closed, but I know it's still there, waiting for me to come closer. The morning the locks changed, I almost didn't notice. I was juggling too much at once. A briefcase, my phone, a mug of coffee balanced precariously in my hand. The keys slid into the deadbolt smoothly, the turn far easier than usual. It felt new, a little too new. I glanced down and saw the brass glinting, shiny and unblemished, not the scratched and weathered lock I'd lived with for 5 years. I frowned but said nothing, stepped inside, and let the door swing shut behind me. The apartment was just as I'd left it. The same pile of unopened mail sat on the counter. My jacket was slung over the back of the couch, where I'd tossed it the night before. Everything seemed in place, but there was a faint scent hanging in the air. Something sweet, like flowers left too long in water. I didn't think much of it at the time. I chalked it up to the landlord replacing the lock without notice. Maybe there had been a break-in, or maybe the old one had finally given out. It wasn't worth the energy to care. I moved through my morning routine, locking the door behind me when I left. That night, I came home to find the door slightly ajar. My stomach tightened. I was certain I'd locked it before leaving. My mind began racing through possibilities. Someone had broken in, or maybe maintenance had come by for repairs and forgotten to close up. I pushed the door open cautiously. The apartment was silent. Nothing was out of place. The pile of mail was untouched. My jacket was still on the couch. And yet, the air felt wrong. Too still. Too heavy. I called the landlord to ask if anyone had been in, but he didn't pick up. Eventually, I convinced myself I'd simply forgotten to shut the door properly in my morning rush. That was when I found the photograph. It was sitting on the coffee table, half buried under a stack of magazines. I almost missed it entirely. Picking it up, I saw it was an old Polaroid, the edges fraying slightly, the image faded. It was a picture of my living room. At first, I assumed it was a coincidence. Maybe I'd taken it years ago and forgotten about it. But something was off. The furniture was the same, the angles identical, but the photo wasn't quite right. In the picture, there was someone standing in the corner of the room. A faint figure, blurred and indistinct, barely more than a smudge. I stared at it for a long moment, my pulse quickening. My mind scrambled for explanations. A trick of the light, an old memory misfiled. I put the photo back on the table, trying not to think too hard about it. The next morning, it was gone. At first, I thought I'd misplaced it, but I scoured the apartment and found no trace of it. It wasn't under the magazines, on the floor, or tucked between the couch cushions. It had simply vanished. That night, another photograph appeared. This one was on my nightstand, propped against the lamp. The subject was the same, my living room, but the figure in the corner was clearer now. It was taller than I'd expected, its shape vaguely humanoid, but with proportions that felt wrong. Too thin, too long. Its head was turned slightly, as if watching something just outside the frame. I didn't sleep well that night. The photos kept coming, one by one, always appearing in places I couldn't ignore. On the kitchen counter, the bathroom sink, the seat of my chair. Each one was slightly different, as though they were frames from a film being played out slowly over days. The figure moved closer in each photo, inching forward with agonizing patience. By the 7th photo, it was standing in the center of the room, its head tilted toward the camera, and though its face was still indistinct, I felt its focus like a weight pressing against my chest. I stopped sleeping entirely after that. I tried throwing the photos away. I burned them in the kitchen sink, watched the flames curl the edges into blackened ash. But the next morning, they were back, pristine and untouched, scattered across the coffee table like playing cards. I stopped going home. I stayed at a motel for 3 nights, desperate for space to think, to breathe. But on the 3rd night, I found a photograph under my pillow. It wasn't of my apartment this time. It was of the motel room, taken from the angle of the mirror above the sink. The figure was in the doorway. I checked out immediately, returning to my apartment because it felt like the lesser evil. When I opened the door, I found every surface covered in photographs. They were taped to the walls, scattered across the floor, piled high on the furniture. Hundreds of images of my apartment, each one showing the figure in various positions. Standing in the kitchen, crouched by the couch, looming over my bed. And in every single photo, the figure was facing the camera. I called the police. When the officers arrived, the photographs were gone. The apartment was pristine, as though nothing had ever been out of place. They gave me polite but skeptical looks as they took my statement, and when they left, I could feel the weight of their doubt hanging in the air. That night, the photographs came back. I didn't touch them this time. I didn't even try to move them. I sat in the middle of the room, surrounded by images of my own life being consumed, piece by piece, by something I couldn't understand. The final photograph appeared just before dawn. It wasn't of my apartment this time. It was of me. I was sitting in the center of the room, exactly as I was in that moment. But behind me, the figure loomed, its face pressed close to mine. For the first time, I could see its features clearly. They were mine. I don't live there anymore, but sometimes I still find photographs waiting for me. They show places I've never been, rooms I've never seen, and in every one, the figure is there, watching. It had always been there, the house on the hill, a hulking silhouette of stone and wood that overlooked the town like a quiet judge. It wasn't abandoned. People said it was occupied, though no one ever seemed to see anyone coming or going. The shutters were always closed, the driveway empty, the garden wild and tangled. But the lights would flicker on in the evenings, glowing faintly through the curtains, a sign of life that dared you to question it. Penny had spent most of her 23 years in the shadow of that house. As a child, she'd run past it on her way to school, her friends daring each other to stop and touch the rusted gate. None of them ever did. As a teenager, she'd avoided its path entirely, finding alternate routes to get wherever she was going. But now, older and living alone on the edge of town, she found herself drawn to it in ways she couldn't explain. It started with the letters. The first one arrived on her doorstep, a pale cream envelope with her name written in looping, unfamiliar handwriting. There was no return address, but the postmark showed it had come from the very same town. Inside was a single sentence written in a precise hand. "You are not who you think you are." She laughed at first, assuming it was a prank, the kind of nonsense small towns specialize in when they're bored. But the second letter came a week later, then the third. Each one was the same. Cryptic phrases that felt too personal to dismiss. The key is closer than you think. What you've forgotten, it remembers. Go to the house. By the fifth letter, Penny stopped trying to ignore them. She kept them in a drawer, laid out in careful order, as though staring at them long enough might force them to make sense. She couldn't say why she cared. They were just words, meaningless if she chose not to follow them. But something about the last message lingered. Go to the house. The words seemed to echo in her mind whenever she glanced at the hill, the faint outline of the house visible even from her kitchen window. She decided to go, not because she believed the letters, she told herself, but because it was the only way to stop their pull. If she saw the house up close, confirmed that it was just a house, nothing strange or special, maybe the letters would stop. The gate groaned when she pushed it open. The garden was worse up close, overgrown with thorned vines and weeds that snagged at her jeans. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and something metallic, like rusted tools left out too long. She hesitated at the front steps, her fingers brushing the weathered railing. The door opened before she could knock. A man stood in the threshold, tall and thin. his sharp features framed by the dim glow of the hallway behind him. His eyes were a pale, unnatural gray, and though his face was calm, there was something unsettling about the way he held her gaze. "You came," he said, as though he had been expecting her. "I got letters," Penny said, her voice unsteady. "Of course you did." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Come in." Every instinct told her to turn around, to leave and never come back. But her feet carried her forward, and before she knew it, she was standing in the entryway, the door closing behind her with a soft click. The house was not what she expected. It was pristine, the kind of old-world elegance that felt more museum than home. The floor was polished wood, the walls lined with bookshelves and portraits of people whose eyes seemed to follow her as she passed. The air was cool, almost too cool, and her footsteps echoed faintly despite the rugs. "This way," the man said, leading her down a corridor that seemed longer than the house should allow. "What is this about?" Penny asked, her voice sharper now. "Why am I here?" "You're here because you belong," he said without turning. "You've always belonged. I don't even know you." "No," he said, stopping in front of a door at the end of the hall. "But the house does." The door opened on its own, revealing a room unlike the others. It was circular, its walls made of smooth, dark stone. In the center was a table, and on the table lay a book. Its cover was black, its edges bound in silver, and as Penny stepped closer, the faint scent of rain filled the air. "What is this?" she asked, her fingers hovering above the book's surface. "Your story," the man said. "Or rather, the parts you've forgotten." She wanted to laugh, to dismiss him as a lunatic, but something about the book felt wrong. Familiar and unfamiliar all at once. Her name was etched into the cover in that same looping handwriting as the letters. "You don't have to open it," the man said, his voice softer now. "But if you do, you'll remember. All of it." Penny hesitated. "Remember what?" "What you are. What you've always been." The words sent a shiver through her, but she couldn't step away. Slowly, she opened the book. The pages were blank at first, but as she turned them, faint lines began to appear. Images, like sketches, unfolding a story she didn't recognize but somehow knew was hers. A house consumed by fire. A child standing alone in the ashes. A figure in the shadows, reaching out a hand. As the images grew sharper, so did the memories. Flashes of a life she didn't know she'd lived. A family lost to something she couldn't name. A deal made in desperation. A house on a hill that had been waiting for her return. She dropped the book, her breath catching as the room tilted around her. The man stepped closer, steadying her with a hand on her shoulder. "You're not what you think you are," he said gently. "And now, neither is the world." The room dissolved around them, the walls falling away to reveal a sky too vast and too dark to belong to Earth. The stars were wrong, closer, brighter, pulsing faintly as if alive. The ground beneath her feet was no longer wood but stone, its surface humming with energy. "This isn't real," she whispered. "It is now," the man said. "You opened the book. You let it in." Her name echoed in the vastness, carried on a wind that wasn't a wind, and Penny realized with chilling certainty that the house had never been waiting for her. She had been waiting for it. When I first saw the house, I didn't think it was real. It was perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean, impossibly narrow, like a knife jutting into the sky. The walls were all windows, reflecting the storm clouds above, and the wind howled through the surrounding rocks as if the earth itself were in mourning. I'd found it online, a last-minute rental listed with almost no description, just a name, Haven House. It seemed like a cruel joke, calling something so sharp and isolated a haven. But I needed the solitude. After losing my father, then my job in quick succession, I felt like I was coming apart. A few weeks alone by the sea seemed like the perfect way to put myself back together. When I arrived, there was no one to greet me, just a key waiting in a small box by the front door. The note inside read, "Leave everything as you found it." Inside, the house was cold and eerily empty, despite its modern furniture and sleek design. Every room was filled with glass and angles, no soft edges or warmth. The ocean spread out below the cliff, restless and gray, and the sound of the waves echoed through the house like whispers in a cavern. The first few days were uneventful. I spent most of my time in the sitting room, staring out at the water or writing in my journal. The wind rattled the glass panes at night, but I told myself it was just the nature of the place, built to weather storms. The unease began subtly. At first, it was the sense that the house was bigger than it seemed. From the outside, it was narrow and sharp, but inside, the hallways stretched farther than I remembered, and the rooms seemed to shift. I would walk to the kitchen, turn around, and feel like the sitting room was farther away than it had been. The light was strange, too. Even on sunny days, the windows never let in warmth, only a cold, silver glow that made the shadows look deeper. At night, the house became a black mirror, the glass reflecting endless copies of myself staring back. And then there was the door. It was tucked into the far end of the second-floor hallway, barely noticeable at first. The design matched the rest of the house, polished wood and sleek metal, but it had no handle, only a keyhole. I didn't remember seeing it on my first day, but by the time I noticed it, it felt like it had always been there. When I pressed my ear to the door, I swore I could hear something on the other side. Not voices, exactly, but a faint rustling, like someone shuffling through papers. I tried the key from the box outside, but it didn't fit. I told myself it was probably a storage room, locked to keep renters from snooping. But as the days went on, I couldn't stop thinking about it. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was the wind again, a trick of the house's hollow design. But the sound was distinct, deliberate, a soft, measured tread moving down the hall outside my bedroom. I stayed frozen in bed, every muscle tensed, listening as the steps grew closer. They stopped just outside my door. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I waited, holding my breath, until I couldn't stand it any longer. I threw open the door, expecting, I don't know what. The hallway was empty. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach twist. A single, wet footprint on the wooden floor, just outside my door. It was too large to be mine and too clear to be an accident. That was when I called the rental agency. "Oh, Haven House," the woman on the other end said, her voice too bright. "We haven't rented that one out in a while. Everything okay?" I hesitated. Has anyone else been here recently? Staff, or someone checking the property? "No," she said. "It's just you." I didn't press further. I hung up and spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself to leave. But there was a part of me, a stubborn, stupid part, that didn't want to give up. I told myself it was my imagination, that grief and isolation were playing tricks on me. That night, the door in the hallway was open. I found it at midnight, the faint sound of rustling papers drawing me from my room. The door that had been locked since I arrived now stood ajar, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down into darkness. I should have turned around. I should have walked out of the house and never looked back. But something about the door pulled at me, an invisible thread winding tighter with every breath. The stairs were colder than the rest of the house, the air thick and damp. I used my phone's flashlight to guide me, but the beam barely pierced the dark. The walls were lined with something soft, almost like fabric, but when I touched it, my fingers came away wet. At the bottom of the stairs was a room. It was small and circular, the walls covered in mirrors like the ones upstairs. But these weren't clean, modern panels. They were cracked and stained. The glass warped like it had melted and reformed. My reflection stared back at me from 100 different angles, distorted and wrong. In the center of the room was a desk. On it sat an open book, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. I stepped closer, the sound of my own breathing deafening in the silence. The pages weren't filled with words, but with sketches. Horrible, frantic sketches of faces, twisted and screaming, their eyes hollow. Then I saw the last page. It was blank, except for a single sentence scrawled in dark, uneven letters. "Leave before it finds you." The door slammed shut behind me. I don't remember how I got out of that room. The next thing I knew, I was in my car, the house shrinking in my rearview mirror as the sun rose behind me. I didn't stop driving until I was back in the city, surrounded by noise and light and life. The rental agency called me the next day. They said they'd been trying to reach me, that Haven House wasn't supposed to be available. It had been removed from their listings years ago, after the last tenant went missing. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want to know. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think I hear it again. The sound of rustling papers, the soft creak of footsteps outside my door. And I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. If it had found me. If it still will. I first noticed the man in the parking garage on a Thursday evening. It had been a long day, and I was juggling my laptop bag, an umbrella, and a lukewarm cup of coffee as I hurried to my car. He stood in the far corner of the garage, partially obscured by shadows, his head tilted slightly as if he were listening to something only he could hear. I wouldn't have given him a second thought if it weren't for the way he turned to face me as I walked by, his gaze sharp and unblinking, cutting through the dim, flickering fluorescent light. I fumbled with my keys, muttering a distracted, "Hey." Out of habit. He didn't respond, didn't move, but I felt his eyes follow me all the way to my car. Even as I drove out of the garage, the image of him standing there stayed with me, his silhouette etched into the back of my mind. By the time I got home, I'd almost forgotten about him. Almost. But that night, as I lay in bed scrolling through my phone, a strange unease settled over me. I couldn't place it. My apartment was quiet, my doors were locked, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been nothing. Stress, exhaustion, maybe too much caffeine. The man in the garage was probably waiting for a ride or lost in his own thoughts. I told myself these things as I rode the elevator down to the parking level, but when the doors slid open, my breath caught in my throat. He was there again. Same corner, same posture, head tilted just slightly. He wasn't wearing the same clothes. Yesterday it had been a dark jacket. Today it was something lighter, but it was definitely him. His eyes locked onto mine the moment I stepped out of the elevator. I forced myself to act normal, walking briskly to my car, pretending I didn't notice him. As I got in, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He hadn't moved, but his head had turned to follow me. By the third day, I was sure he was following me. He wasn't always in the garage. Sometimes, I'd see him on the sidewalk near my office or across the street at the cafe where I grabbed lunch. Once, I caught a glimpse of him on the subway, though he was gone when I looked again. He never approached, never said a word, but his presence was constant, an itch I couldn't scratch. It wasn't until the following week that I decided to confront him. I'd spotted him again in the parking garage, this time closer than before. He was leaning against a concrete pillar, his face partially obscured by the brim of a baseball cap. My heart pounded as I walked toward him, my steps echoing in the cavernous space. "Hey!" I called out, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Who are you? Why do you keep following me?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back into the shadows, his movements unervingly fluid, and disappeared behind a row of cars. I ran after him, my adrenaline spiking, but when I turned the corner, he was gone. The garage was empty, the air still. That night, I called a friend. "There's this guy," I said, pacing my living room. "He keeps showing up, at work, in my parking garage, everywhere. I think he's following me. Have you called the police?" I hesitated. What could I tell them? That a man I didn't know was standing near me in public places? He hadn't done anything, hadn't threatened me, or even spoken to me. "They won't do anything," I said finally. "Not unless he actually, I don't know, does something." "You should document it," my friend suggested. "Take pictures, write down when you see him. At least that way, if it gets worse, you'll have proof." It wasn't a bad idea. The next time I saw him, I pulled out my phone. He was standing across the street from my building, half hidden behind a bus shelter. I snapped a picture quickly, trying to act casual. When I looked at the photo later, my stomach dropped. He wasn't there. The bus shelter, the street, the distant outline of buildings. Everything was exactly as it should have been, but the space where he had been standing was empty. I stared at the photo for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of it. Had I imagined him? No. I'd seen him, as clearly as I was seeing my own reflection in the phone's screen. The days that followed blurred together. I saw him everywhere now, always in the corner of my vision, always gone when I turned to face him. He was in reflections, shadows, fleeting glimpses that disappeared the moment I tried to focus. My world began to shrink, the boundaries of my life drawn tighter and tighter by his silent presence. And then, one night, he came to my door. The knock was soft, almost polite, but it sent a jolt of fear through my chest. I crept to the peephole, my heart hammering in my ears. He was standing there, his face pale and drawn in the dim light of the hallway. His head was tilted, the way it always was, but this time, his eyes weren't blank. They were full of something. Recognition? Regret? What do you want? I demanded, my voice breaking. For the first time, he spoke. You let me in once, he said, his voice low and hollow. Don't you remember? I didn't, but something in his tone, something in his eyes, made me think he was telling the truth. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. He knocked again, louder this time, the sound reverberating through the apartment. You let me in, he repeated. Now I can't leave. I stayed up all night, sitting in the corner of my living room with every light on, clutching my phone in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. But the knocks never came again. By morning, he was gone. I haven't seen him since, but sometimes, when I pass reflective surfaces, I catch a glimpse of something behind me. A shape, a shadow. I don't turn around anymore. The box wasn't supposed to be delivered to my address. When I got home that evening, it was waiting on my porch, taped tightly and bearing a label with my name, but no sender. My apartment complex wasn't exactly known for its reliable mail service. I'd had packages rerouted, lost, even stolen, but this was different. There was no delivery service logo, no tracking number, and the handwriting on the label was unfamiliar. I carried it inside, its weight heavier than expected, and set it on the kitchen table. The box had a strange smell, faint but unpleasant, like damp wood and old metal. I leaned closer, inspecting the tape, when I noticed something odd. The seams of the box weren't sealed with adhesive. The tape was ornamental, crisscrossed in jagged patterns that didn't quite make sense. I grabbed a knife and sliced through it, half expecting the box to pop open on its own. But it didn't. The flaps felt stuck, almost reluctant, as I pried them apart. Inside was a single object, an ornate, rectangular device that looked like a cross between an antique radio and an old projector. Its brass edges were tarnished, and the glass in the center was cloudy, faintly shimmering like water under moonlight. A small metal crank was attached to one side, and beneath it, a plaque bore an inscription, "To hear what's been lost." I turned the crank without thinking. It was smooth at first, but the farther I wound it, the more resistance I felt, as though the gears inside were alive and resisting my effort. When I couldn't turn it anymore, the device clicked softly, and a low hum filled the room. At first, the sound was nothing, a faint crackle of static, like an old radio tuning between stations. Then, faintly, I began to hear something, a voice. It was quiet, distant, but unmistakable. A woman's voice, speaking in a slow, deliberate tone. "Do you remember the day it rained?" The sound was strange, tinny and warped, as though it had been recorded decades ago. My stomach twisted at the question, though I didn't know why. I didn't remember a day like that. At least, I didn't think I did. The device clicked again, and the voice changed. "You said you wouldn't forget," a man's voice said, this one sharper, accusatory. "But you did." My hands trembled as I reached for the crank, desperate to stop the device, but something compelled me to turn it again. The hum deepened, and another voice emerged, this one softer, almost a whisper. "Come back," it said. "It's still waiting for you." I shoved the box off the table, the device clattering to the floor. The voices stopped instantly, replaced by silence so profound it felt like the room had been sucked dry of air. I spent the rest of the evening staring at the thing, debating whether to throw it away or call someone, anyone, to take it off my hands. But every time I moved toward it, something held me back. That night, I dreamed of a room I didn't recognize. It was dimly lit, the walls covered in faded wallpaper that seemed to ripple like water. In the center of the room was the device, its glass surface glowing faintly. Around it were shadows, indistinct figures standing perfectly still. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. The device was back on the table, upright and pristine, as though I hadn't touched it. I decided to take it outside, to leave it on the curb for the garbage truck. But the moment I stepped into the hallway, I froze. The door to my neighbor's apartment was open. Mrs. Gibbons was in her 70s and rarely left her home. She was kind, always waving when I passed, but I hadn't seen her in weeks. The open door felt wrong, like a wound in the quiet corridor. "Mrs. Gibbons?" I called, stepping closer. No answer. The inside of her apartment was dim, the air thick with the smell of dust and something faintly sweet. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure of what to do, when I heard it. A hum. It was faint but unmistakable, the same low vibration the device had made when I first cranked it. The sound was coming from deeper inside the apartment. I should have left, called someone, anything but what I did, which was follow the noise. Her living room was immaculate, the kind of space preserved for guests who never came. But the hum wasn't coming from there. It led me to a small room at the back of the apartment, a place I'd never seen before. Inside was a table, and on it was another device, nearly identical to the one that had been delivered to me. This one was larger, its brass edges darker, almost blackened. The glass surface flickered faintly, and as I stepped closer, the hum deepened. "Mrs. Gibbons?" I whispered, though I knew she wasn't there. The device clicked, and a voice emerged. "She never stopped looking," it said. The voice wasn't hers. It wasn't anyone I recognized, but the weight of the words made my chest tighten. Before I could stop myself, I reached out and touched the glass. It was warm, almost pulsing beneath my fingers, and the moment I made contact, the room shifted. The wallpaper rippled like in my dream, the floor beneath my feet softening as though it were no longer solid. The hum grew louder, deafening now, and the voice returned, overlapping with others, dozens of them, all speaking at once. They were fragments of sentences, pieces of memories I didn't recognize but felt were mine. "You promised. Do you remember? It's still there." The glass beneath my hand cracked, and the sound stopped. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my apartment. The box was gone. So was Mrs. Gibbons. Her apartment was empty the next day, cleared out as though no one had ever lived there. When I asked the landlord, he said she'd moved out weeks ago, though he couldn't tell me where. The device hasn't reappeared, but sometimes, when the apartment is quiet, I hear the hum. And sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I think I hear my name. The envelope was waiting for me when I got home, tucked neatly beneath my apartment door. It was thick and expensive looking, the kind of stationery reserved for weddings or court summonses. My name was scrawled on the front in elegant handwriting I didn't recognize. No return address. I hesitated before opening it. There was something about the weight of the envelope, the faint scent of ink and age that clung to it, that made my stomach churn. When I finally tore it open, a single sheet of paper slid into my hand. The letter read, "You are cordially invited to an evening of discovery. Tonight, 9 p.m. room 616, the Halcyon." No signature, no explanation, just those words in the same flowing script. I stared at the note for a long time, unsure whether to be intrigued or terrified. The Halcyon was an old hotel downtown, the kind of place that had been glamorous decades ago but now survived on a threadbare reputation and tourists who didn't know better. I hadn't been there in years. Logic told me to toss the letter in the trash. I didn't know who had sent it or why, but something about the message itched at my curiosity. The handwriting felt deliberate, almost personal, as if it had been written just for me. By the time 8:30 rolled around, I found myself pulling on my coat and heading out into the night. The Halcyon loomed like a ghost against the city skyline, its once grand facade marred by grime and neglect. The revolving door squeaked as I pushed through, and the lobby greeted me with a blend of faded elegance and stale air. A bored-looking clerk glanced up from behind the desk but said nothing as I passed. The elevator groaned as it climbed to the 6th floor, each ding echoing louder than the last. When the doors slid open, I was met with a long hallway lined with ornate sconces that cast the walls in flickering light. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something sweeter, like flowers left to rot. Room 616 was at the very end. The door was unremarkable, its brass numbers dull with age. I raised my hand to knock, but before my knuckles touched the wood, the door creaked open. Inside, the room was dark, lit only by the glow of a single candle on a small table in the center. The furniture was sparse, the walls bare except for a large mirror that hung above an empty fireplace. There was no sign of whoever had sent the letter. I stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind me with a quiet click. My pulse quickened, but I told myself to stay calm. There had to be an explanation. "Hello?" I called, my voice too loud in the stillness. No answer, but as I moved closer to the table, I saw an object resting beside the candle. A small, black envelope. My name was etched on the front in the same handwriting as the first letter. I opened it, my fingers trembling. Inside was a single card. "To begin, Sid." I looked around the room again, half expecting someone to jump out from the shadows. But there was no one, just the table, the candle, and the mirror that seemed to watch me from across the room. Against my better judgment, I pulled out the chair and sat. The candle flickered, its flame bending unnaturally toward the mirror. For a moment, the reflection of the room shimmered, as though I were looking at it through water. Then the image shifted. I wasn't in the reflection anymore. The chair was empty. The table, the candle, they were still there, but the figure sitting in my place was gone. I leaned forward, my breath fogging the glass, and watched as the room in the mirror continued to change. The walls stretched, the shadows deepened, and a figure emerged from the corner. A silhouette, tall and thin, its movements unnervingly fluid. It turned toward me. I jerked back, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. The figure in the mirror froze, its head tilting slightly, as if curious. Its face, or where a face should have been, was smooth and featureless, a blank slate that seemed to absorb the light. I stood, backing away from the mirror, but the reflection didn't move with me. The figure in the mirror stepped closer to the glass, and the room around it shifted again, warping into a version of the space that felt impossibly wrong. The candle's flame in the mirror turned black, casting no light, and the shadows twisted into shapes I couldn't comprehend. The figure raised a hand and placed it against the glass. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the surface rippled, like liquid, and the hand began to push through. Panic surged through me. I turned to the door, but it wouldn't budge. My hands clawed at the handle, the wood, anything to get out, but the room held me like a trap. Behind me, I heard the faint sound of something wet sliding across the floor. I turned just in time to see the figure stepping out of the mirror. Its movements were deliberate, almost graceful, but wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. It didn't walk so much as glide, its blank face tilted toward me. I backed into the door, my heart pounding. "What do you want?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure it could understand me. It didn't answer. Instead, it reached out, its hand impossibly long, its fingers curling like smoke. As it touched my shoulder, a wave of cold shot through me, and the world seemed to tilt. When I opened my eyes, I was sitting at the table again. The candle burned steadily, the mirror was empty, and the room was still. My breathing was shallow, my hands trembling as I reached for the black envelope, now back on the table. The card inside read, "You are free to leave." I didn't need to be told twice. The door opened easily this time, and I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. The hotel was silent, its shadows too deep, its walls too close. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the night air biting against my skin. I never went back to the Halcyon, but sometimes, when I pass by a mirror, I see something in the corner of my eye. A flicker of movement, a blank face watching, waiting. When I was a kid, my father had a ritual for getting rid of old furniture. Instead of taking it to the dump or leaving it on the curb, he'd drive out to this clearing in the woods behind our house, a place he called the Spot. It was always just before sunset when he'd load up whatever piece of furniture had outlived its usefulness, an old chair, a broken dresser, and take it to the clearing. My siblings and I never went with him. We were forbidden to follow, though we often begged and made bets on who'd be brave enough to sneak after him next time. Once, when I was about 10, I worked up the nerve to ask him why. Why take things all the way out there instead of leaving them on the curb like everyone else? He'd paused, his hand lingering on the battered armrest of a recliner he'd been loading into the truck. "Because they don't belong here anymore," he said. At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. Furniture didn't belong anywhere. It wasn't alive, didn't have feelings. But his answer silenced me. There was something final in his tone, something that told me not to ask again. Years later, after my father passed and I moved back into the old house, I couldn't stop thinking about the spot. It had become one of those childhood mysteries that gnawed at me more with age, and now that I was living in the house alone, I couldn't resist its pull. The woods had changed since I was a kid, the paths overgrown and the air heavier than I remembered. I searched for nearly an hour, cutting through brambles and stepping over gnarled roots, before I found it. The clearing wasn't anything special, just a patch of grass surrounded by tall, dark trees. But in the middle of it, there was a chair. It wasn't the recliner my father had taken all those years ago. This chair was different, a straight-backed wooden thing, its varnish peeling and its legs warped with age. It faced the trees, its seat tilted slightly as if it had been left mid-use. I approached cautiously, unsure why I felt the need to tread lightly. The clearing was silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the distant chirp of a bird. Just stillness. There was something off about the chair, though I couldn't pinpoint what. It was just a chair, after all. But the longer I looked at it, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't until I turned to leave that I noticed the second chair. This one was almost identical to the first, except the wood was darker, and its seat was slightly sunken. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. I had scanned the clearing thoroughly when I arrived. I backed away, my chest tightening, and that's when I noticed the third chair. It was smaller, almost child-sized, its surface dotted with faint scratches that might have been carvings or something more organic. I didn't stay to count the others. I didn't want to know how many there were or how they'd gotten there. I stumbled back through the woods, the sound of my own breathing filling my ears. When I reached the house, I locked every door and window, my hands trembling as I tried to calm myself. It was ridiculous. Furniture didn't move. Chairs didn't appear out of nowhere. It had to be some kind of trick, maybe a group of teenagers messing around. But that night, I woke to the sound of scraping. It was faint at first, like the whisper of fabric against wood, but it grew louder, closer. It came from the living room. My heart pounded as I crept down the stairs, clutching the flashlight I kept by my bed. The beam of light swept across the room, illuminating the couch, the coffee table, the shelves. Nothing seemed out of place. And then the flashlight landed on the chair. It was the straight-backed wooden chair from the clearing, now sitting in the center of my living room. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The chair was impossibly still, its legs planted firmly on the hardwood floor. I didn't know how it had gotten there, and I didn't want to know. I grabbed my phone and called the police. By the time they arrived, the chair was gone. The officers were polite but skeptical, their expressions softening into something pitying as they suggested I might have been dreaming. But I knew what I saw. The next day, I found a faint trail of scratches leading from the front door to the living room, like something heavy had been dragged across the floor. I tried to ignore it, but the scraping sounds returned that night, and the night after that. Each time, the chair reappeared in a different room. My kitchen, the hallway, once even in my bedroom. It always looked the same, worn, silent, and utterly wrong. Then, one morning, I woke to find not one chair, but three. They were arranged in a perfect line in my living room, their backs facing me, as if waiting for someone to sit in them. The air in the house felt colder, heavier, and I couldn't stop the shiver that ran down my spine. I tried to move them, to take them outside, but the moment my hands touched the wood, a sound filled the room, a low, groaning creak that made my teeth ache. I let go immediately, stumbling backward, and the sound stopped. That's when I noticed the carvings. On the surface of each chair were faint marks, shallow but deliberate. At first, they looked like random scratches, but as I leaned closer, I realized they weren't scratches at all. They were names. The first chair bore my father's name, etched into the wood so faintly it was almost invisible. The second chair carried my mother's, though she had passed when I was a child. And the third had my name. I didn't stay to see if there were more chairs. I left the house that night and haven't gone back. Sometimes, though, I dream of the clearing. I see the chairs, more of them now, stretching in neat rows far beyond the edge of the trees. And in the distance, I hear scraping, waiting. The first time I noticed something strange, it wasn't dramatic or frightening. It was just off. I was in my kitchen making tea, something I did every evening. The kettle was whistling softly, the room filled with the earthy scent of chamomile. I reached for a spoon to stir in some honey, and that's when I realized the drawer wasn't the right one. It was in the same place, but it didn't feel familiar. The handle was colder than usual, the movement of the drawer too smooth, almost mechanical. And inside, the spoons didn't belong to me. They weren't the plain, slightly mismatched ones I'd used for years. These were sleek, polished, with handles etched in patterns I couldn't place, swirls and curves that made my eyes ache if I looked too long. I froze, my hand hovering over them. A moment later, the kettle hissed, breaking the spell. I closed the drawer and grabbed a mug, telling myself I was tired, that it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. The next morning, the window in my living room was taller. Not bigger in any measurable way, just taller, the top stretching a few inches higher than it had before. It let in more light than usual, casting sharp, angular shadows across the floor. I stared at it, feeling the same unease I'd felt with the spoons. It wasn't wrong enough to scream at me, but it gnawed at the edges of my thoughts, like a melody you can't quite remember. And then, 3 days later, my couch moved. I came home from work, juggling my keys and a bag of groceries, and there it was, sitting at a slight angle, just enough to notice. I pushed it back, muttering about the uneven floors, but as I did, I felt resistance. Not like it was stuck, like it didn't want to move. That night, I barely slept. The apartment wasn't loud or threatening. It was quiet, almost too quiet. But every time I closed my eyes, I felt the faintest tug in the back of my mind, as though the space around me was waiting for something. The next morning, the spoons were back to normal. So was the couch. But the window wasn't. It had shifted again, now slightly narrower, its edges sharper. It looked more like a painting of a window than the real thing. That's when I decided to test it. I grabbed a small piece of tape from my desk and stuck it on the window frame, placing it neatly along the bottom corner. A marker, I thought. Something to prove that whatever was happening wasn't just my imagination. The following morning, the tape was gone. In its place was something else, a faint, spiraling mark etched into the glass. It looked almost deliberate, like someone had carved it there with a knife. I didn't touch it. Over the next week, the changes became bolder. My bathroom mirror reflected things that weren't there. A door frame that didn't exist, the faint outline of a plant I'd never owned. The rug in my bedroom began curling at the edges, the pattern shifting subtly into shapes that looked like letters, though they weren't from any alphabet I recognized. And the shadows, they didn't stay still anymore. By the end of the week, I realized it wasn't my apartment that was shifting. It was me. One evening, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. At first, it looked normal, just me tired, hair a little messy. But then I noticed my left eye. It was off by a fraction of an inch, just enough to be noticeable. I blinked, leaned closer, and it corrected itself as though it had been caught out. I didn't tell anyone. How could I? How do you explain that the space you've lived in for years feels less like a home and more like a thing watching you? The next night, the change wasn't subtle. I woke to a sound, not loud, but persistent, a faint scraping, like nails against wood. It was coming from the kitchen. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and made my way down the hall. The light from the living room stretched too far, illuminating the edges of the kitchen in strange, fragmented shapes. And there, sitting on the counter, was the drawer. Not the spoons, the entire drawer. It had been pulled out and placed perfectly in the center of the counter. The contents were arranged in a neat spiral, the spoons gleaming under the faint light from the window. The spiral pattern was familiar. It was the same as the mark on the glass. I didn't touch anything. Instead, I backed out of the kitchen and locked myself in my room, sitting on the bed with my back against the door. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke to sunlight streaming through the window. The apartment was silent, and when I checked the kitchen, the drawer was back in place. But there was something new on the floor. A single piece of paper, folded into a precise square. I picked it up with shaking hands and opened it. The words were written in my handwriting. "Stay where you are." I don't remember writing it. The next day, the apartment was empty. Not of furniture or belongings. Those were all there. But it felt hollow, as though the walls and floors had been peeled away, leaving only a thin shell behind. The window was gone. The spiraling mark had spread across the glass of the bathroom mirror, curling outward like veins. And my reflection didn't move anymore. Now, when I look at it, I see something waiting. I don't know what will happen if I leave, but I'm starting to think that's exactly what it wants. On the surface, it was just a missing hour. I woke up at 8:47 a.m., according to my phone. The time didn't register as odd until I noticed the clock on the bedside table flashing 7:47 a.m. I'd been meaning to fix it for weeks, so I brushed it off and headed to the kitchen for coffee. But the microwave read 6:47 a.m. My wall clock? 9:47 a.m. I spent a minute trying to rationalize it. Maybe power outages, battery quirks, something mundane. Yet something about the inconsistency felt deliberate, like the clocks weren't just wrong. They were trying to tell me something. By the time I left the apartment, I felt untethered, as if the day itself had skipped a beat. The sky looked too sharp, a brittle shade of blue that didn't feel real. I walked to my car, the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes oddly muted. My watch said 10:03. When I arrived at work, it was 9:59. I didn't notice the discrepancy until I was logging into my computer. I wasn't late, but I should have been. A 45-minute drive compressed into less than 30? No traffic, no speeding, nothing unusual, except that it was impossible. My day unfolded with strange, quiet distortions. A pen disappeared from my desk, reappearing moments later in my hand. The office printer spat out a page covered in numbers I didn't recognize, then shut itself off. I felt a faint pressure behind my eyes, like a low-grade headache that couldn't decide whether to bloom or fade. Then, during lunch, the email arrived. The subject line was blank. No sender. No timestamp. The body of the email contained a single line. "Have you noticed yet?" I deleted it. The rest of the afternoon crawled by, uneventful but charged with an undercurrent I couldn't define. By the time I got home, I'd almost convinced myself the day's oddities were a result of exhaustion or distraction. Then I checked my voicemail. There was only one new message, left at 2:31 p.m. A time I knew for certain I'd been sitting at my desk, scrolling through spreadsheets, my phone silent. The message was garbled at first, static mingling with faint clicks and hums. Then a voice emerged, low and deliberate, speaking in a tone that was almost soothing. "You're slipping," it said. "Don't you see it yet?" My breath hitched, and I replayed the message twice, trying to decipher the words or recognize the voice. But it didn't sound like anyone I knew. It didn't even sound like it had been recorded. That night, the dreams began. I was standing on a narrow, featureless road that stretched infinitely in both directions. The landscape around me was flat and empty, the sky above a heavy, unmoving gray. At first, I thought I was alone. Then I heard it, a faint sound, distant but growing. It was a rhythm, a steady crunch, like footsteps on gravel. I turned toward the noise, and in the distance, I saw a figure. It wasn't walking. It was gliding, smooth and unbroken. Yet the crunching footsteps persisted. As the figure came closer, I saw its shape was wrong, too tall, its arms hanging too low, its outline slightly blurred, like a badly compressed image. It didn't have a face, just a smooth expanse where features should have been, and yet I felt its gaze locking onto me. When I woke, the room felt smaller, like the walls had pressed in during the night. My phone buzzed, snapping me out of my haze. Another email. This one had a timestamp, 3:47 a.m. The subject line read, "Almost there." I didn't open it. The next day, my watch stopped working. The The display froze at 11:47 a.m., its hands ticking soundlessly against the glass. Every clock I checked in the house showed a different time. On the way to work, my GPS glitched. It recalculated my route twice, then displayed a map I didn't recognize, long, winding roads bordered by nothing but empty fields. The landmarks were unfamiliar, the names of the streets missing. When I tried to turn back, I realized the road behind me was gone. No exits, no intersections, just the same gray, featureless landscape on either side, stretching endlessly beneath an unbroken sky. Then the radio turned on. The static was sharp, filling the car with a hissing noise that made my skin crawl. A voice broke through, faint and crackling, as if spoken from the far end of a tunnel. "You've slipped too far," it said. "Turn around." "I can't," I shouted, gripping the wheel tighter. The static cut off abruptly. A new sound filled the car, the crunching of footsteps. But this time, they weren't distant. They were inside the car. I looked in the rearview mirror, and my stomach dropped. The figure was sitting in the back seat, its head tilted slightly, its smooth, featureless face turned toward me. Its presence filled the car like a vacuum, the air heavy and sharp, pressing against my lungs. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. When I turned around, the back seat was empty, but in the rearview mirror, the figure was still there. Closer. Its arm rose, impossibly long, the fingers curling into a loose fist. It tapped on the glass of the mirror, 3 deliberate knocks that reverberated through the car. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The road behind me had returned, along with the familiar landmarks of the city. My GPS chirped as it recalibrated, leading me back to familiar streets. I didn't go to work that day. At home, I found another email waiting for me. This one was blank. No message, no subject, just a single attachment, a photo. It was me, sitting in the car, staring into the rearview mirror. And in the reflection, the figure was smiling. The first odd thing was the tree. I walked the same route to work every morning, 3 blocks to the corner cafe, a left onto Birch Avenue, and another 6 blocks to the office. That particular tree stood halfway down Birch, a massive oak with a wide, gnarled trunk and roots that cracked the sidewalk around it. It was impossible to miss, a small landmark in an otherwise monotonous stretch of street. That morning, it wasn't there. I stopped, staring at the empty patch of concrete where the tree should have been. There was no stump, no scars in the pavement where its roots had grown, just smooth sidewalk, as if the tree had never existed. I turned to the woman walking behind me, pointing to the spot. "What happened to the tree?" She gave me a confused glance and walked around me without a word. At the cafe, I mentioned it to the barista while waiting for my order. "You know the big oak on Birch Avenue? It's gone. Did they cut it down?" "What oak?" she asked, sliding my coffee across the counter. "The one halfway down the street. It's been there forever." She shook her head. "I've worked here for 4 years. There's no tree on Birch." I left feeling strangely unmoored, my steps quickening as I approached the office. By the time I reached my desk, I'd nearly convinced myself I'd been mistaken. Maybe I'd dreamed it, or mixed it up with another street. But the tree wasn't the last thing to disappear. The next was a building, a small bookstore on the corner of 8th and Pine, where I'd often browse during my lunch breaks. One afternoon, I walked over, only to find the corner occupied by a clothing boutique I'd never seen before. I stared at it, dumbfounded. The boutique looked aged, weathered, as if it had been there for decades. The storefront was dusty, the signage faded, and the mannequins in the window were dressed in out-of-date fashions. When I asked the cashier inside how long they'd been open, she laughed. "Since 1987. Are you new to the area?" I left without buying anything. At home, I searched for the bookstore online. Nothing came up, not a mention, not a review, not even an address. It was as though it had been scrubbed from existence. Over the next few weeks, the disappearances escalated. A park I jogged through on weekends became a stretch of bland office buildings. A bridge over the river vanished, replaced by a smooth expanse of road, as if the river itself had never existed. When I asked people about these places, they looked at me as though I'd asked them to recall a dream. I don't think there's ever been a park there, one friend said with a shrug. Maybe you're thinking of somewhere else. No one remembered, but I did. One night, desperate for answers, I spread out a map of the city on my kitchen table. I circled every location I could remember disappearing, marking them with red ink. The city was changing, reshaping itself, and no one else seemed to notice. As I stared at the map, a thought struck me. What if something wasn't just removing these places? What if it was replacing them? The boutique, the office buildings, the unbroken stretch of road. They didn't feel new. They felt wrong. Like memories patched into reality, stitched together without regard for what had been there before. I decided to test it. The next morning, I walked to Birch Avenue, where the tree had once stood. I stood in the middle of the sidewalk, staring at the empty space. And then I waited. It took an hour for the first flicker. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle ripple in the air, like heat waves rising from asphalt. For a moment, the sidewalk shimmered, and then it was smooth again, as if nothing had happened. I took a step closer. The air felt heavy, electric, like the atmosphere before a storm. Then I saw it. A man stood in the middle of the street, dressed in a dark suit that seemed to absorb the light around him. He wasn't walking or moving, just standing there, watching me. His face was blurred, not out of focus but intentionally obscured, as though someone had painted over it with a single broad stroke. "Who are you?" I shouted. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether to answer. "You weren't supposed to notice," he said finally. His voice was calm, without inflection, as though he were reading from a script. "Notice what?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he raised one hand, palm facing outward. The air around him shimmered again, and he disappeared. I staggered backward, my chest tight, my head swimming. When I looked down, the sidewalk was different. The tree was back, but it wasn't the same. The bark was smoother, the roots less intrusive, and the branches hung at unnatural angles, like a drawing of a tree rather than the real thing. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man in the suit, his blurred face staring at me. The next day, I walked the city, searching for the places that had disappeared. They were all back, but none of them were right. The park felt too small, the bridge unnervingly silent, the bookstore returned but filled with books I didn't recognize, their titles written in a language I couldn't read. The city wasn't just changing, it was being rewritten, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on to the original draft. When the new neighbor moved into the house next door, I barely noticed at first. It had been empty for years, a hulking Victorian with peeling paint and windows that always seemed to glint like watching eyes. The kind of place that made kids dare each other to get close and adults cross the street without realizing they had. So when a single moving truck appeared one morning and boxes began disappearing inside, I only glanced out the window before going back to my coffee. It was later, when the lights came on for the first time, that I felt strange. They weren't the warm, yellow glow you'd expect. They were too white, too sharp, and they didn't flicker like normal bulbs. Instead, they buzzed faintly, a sound that reached me even across the yard when I opened my window to listen. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as power lines or old wiring, but the longer I sat with it, the more it dug into my mind like a splinter. The next morning, I decided to introduce myself. It seemed polite, and truth be told, I was curious. I hadn't seen anyone come or go after the truck left. No sign of unpacking, no glimpses of life through the windows. Just the lights, still on in the middle of the day. I knocked on the door. There was no answer, though I thought I heard faint movement inside. A rustling sound, like papers being shuffled, or maybe something brushing against the walls. I knocked again, louder this time, and the sound stopped. The door opened just a crack. The man who stood there was tall and thin, with a pale face that seemed to stretch too tight over his skull. His eyes were deep-set, shadowed, and a little too wide, like he was trying to see something far away. He didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at me. "Hi," I managed, forcing a smile. "I'm Sarah. I live next door. Just wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." He blinked, once, slowly. Then he smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. His lips curled up too far, exposing teeth that were small and even, like little white pebbles. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and clipped. "It's good to meet you." Before I could reply, the door shut. I stood there for a moment, staring at the peeling paint, unsure of what had just happened. The polite thing would have been to leave it at that, but something about him, about the whole interaction, itched at the back of my mind. I went home, but I couldn't stop thinking about him. Over the next few days, I started noticing things. Little things. The lights never turned off, not even in the middle of the night. And sometimes, when I woke up around 3 or 4 a.m., I could hear that faint buzzing again, drifting through the walls. Then there were the deliveries. Every afternoon, a white van pulled up in front of his house. The driver wore no uniform, and the packages they carried weren't marked. They were large, wrapped in plain brown paper, and they never stayed on the porch for long. The man, my neighbor, would open the door before the driver even knocked, take the package, and disappear inside. I couldn't help myself. One afternoon, after the van pulled away, I crossed the yard and peeked through one of the front windows. The glass was fogged, and the light inside was so harsh it felt like staring into a fluorescent tunnel. But I saw movement. The man wasn't alone. There were shapes inside, shifting, though I couldn't make out their details. Too many limbs, too fluid, and a strange, rhythmic motion that made my stomach turn. And then one of them turned toward the window. I stumbled back, heart hammering, certain it had seen me. But nothing happened. No one came to the door. No curtains were drawn. I rushed back to my house, locking the door behind me. That night, I heard the buzzing again, louder this time. It wasn't coming from his house. It was coming from mine. I followed the sound to the basement, where the air felt colder, heavier. The buzzing grew sharper as I descended the stairs, until I reached the far corner of the room. There, carved into the concrete wall, was a symbol I didn't recognize. It was jagged and looping, etched deep into the surface, and the edges seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. I reached out, almost without thinking, and the moment my fingers brushed it, the buzzing stopped. I don't remember going back upstairs. The next day, I tried to avoid looking at the house, but my curiosity won out. I sat by the window, watching for the van, for the man, for anything that might explain what was happening. But the house was quiet, until the lights in my kitchen flickered. When I went to check, the buzzing was back, louder than ever, filling my head with its relentless hum. My skin felt hot, too tight, as though the sound was burrowing under it. I turned and saw him standing in my yard. He was looking directly at me, his wide eyes unblinking, his too perfect smile carved across his face. "You shouldn't have looked," he said, his voice cutting through the buzzing like a blade. And then he was gone. I don't know what he is, but the symbol is still in my basement, and the buzzing never stops. I wasn't supposed to find the photograph. It was tucked between the pages of an old book I'd bought at a secondhand store. A thick, yellowed volume that smelled like damp paper and time. The kind of book you buy more for the aesthetic of its cracked spine than for its contents. The photo slipped out when I turned the first page, fluttering to the floor. It was black and white, slightly warped with age. A group of people stood in front of a building, smiling stiffly for the camera. 6 of them, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, sharp suits, high-collar dresses. The edges of the photo were frayed, but the faces were clear. All except one. The man in the center had no face. At first, I thought it was just damage to the photo. The paper was discolored where his features should have been, a faint blur like someone had wiped a thumb across wet ink. I turned the photo over. No names, no dates, just a single word written in pencil. Soon. It shouldn't have meant anything, but it stayed with me, worming its way into my mind as I flipped through the book. I told myself it was nothing, a random photo, a coincidence. I almost tossed it in the trash. Instead, I slipped it back into the book and set it aside. That night, I dreamed of the building. It stood alone in the middle of a field, its dark windows staring out like empty eyes. The people from the photo were there, standing in front of it just as they had been in the picture. But they weren't smiling now. They were staring at me. I woke with the image seared into my mind, the silence of my bedroom feeling heavier than it should. For a long time, I stayed in bed, staring at the faint outline of the book on my nightstand. The next day, I left the photo in a drawer. Still, it followed me. The man with no face appeared in reflections. Not every time, but often enough that I started to avoid mirrors. A glimpse of him in the corner of the bathroom mirror, standing just behind me. A blurred outline in the window at night. I tried to ignore it, but the sensation of being watched grew impossible to shake. The second photo appeared a week later. It was on my kitchen counter, neatly placed as though someone had left it there deliberately. Another black and white image, this one of the same group of people, but now they were inside the building. The faceless man stood by a window, his head tilted slightly, as though he was listening for something. The others were still looking directly at the camera. Their expressions were sharper this time. Their smiles too wide, too perfect. The word on the back was different now. Look. I threw the photo away, but it reappeared that night, tucked under my pillow. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I called the shop where I'd bought the book. The owner was polite, but unhelpful. He didn't remember selling me the book, didn't know anything about a photograph. Old books have history, he said vaguely. That night, the knocking started. It was soft at first, a light tapping at the window. I lived on the third floor, and when I pulled back the curtain, there was nothing there but the street below, empty and quiet. But the knocking didn't stop. It moved to the walls, the floor, the inside of my closet. Always soft, always rhythmic, like someone gently testing the boundaries of my space. And then I heard the whisper. It wasn't words, not exactly, just a faint, breathy sound, too deliberate to be the wind. I spent the night on the couch, every light in the apartment turned on. The third photo came the next day. This one showed just the building, its windows dark and empty. The faceless man was standing in the doorway now, his hand outstretched toward the camera. The back of the photo read, "Come." I didn't want to touch it. Just looking at it made my skin crawl, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Something about the word on the back felt like a command, as though ignoring it would only make things worse. That night, I dreamed of the building again. This time, the door was open, and the faceless man was waiting for me inside. When I woke, the knocking was louder. I decided to go to the building. I didn't know where it was, but I felt like I'd always known, somewhere deep in my bones. I packed a bag, threw the photos into the book, and drove. The road was empty, the sky a dull, overcast gray that seemed too flat, too perfect. I didn't see another car, another person, just mile after mile of open fields, until the building came into view. It looked exactly as it had in the photo. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar, the edges of the structure warped as though it didn't belong in this world. I should have turned around, left the car running, sped back to whatever semblance of normalcy I could salvage. But my legs carried me forward. The inside of the building smelled like damp wood and dust. The floor creaked beneath my feet, the sound echoing in a way that made the space feel impossibly large. The walls were lined with photographs. They covered every surface, hundreds of them, all black and white, all of the same group of people. In some, they were smiling. In others, their expressions were blank, unreadable. In every photo, the faceless man was there. I found the last photograph in the center of the room, placed on a pedestal as though waiting for me. It was of me. I was standing in the doorway of the building, staring at the camera with wide, empty eyes. The faceless man was beside me, his hand on my shoulder. The word on the back read, "Stay." The door slammed shut behind me. And now, I'm in the photos too. The jar appeared on the kitchen counter one morning. A small glass jar with a red metal lid, the kind that might hold jam or pickles. But inside, instead of food, were tiny strips of paper, each one neatly folded. I assumed it was a gift, something quirky he'd picked up at a shop downtown. He liked little gestures like that, or at least, he used to. "What's in the jar?" I asked when he walked into the kitchen, towel drying his hair. He glanced at it briefly, then back at his phone. "Huh, must have been left here by one of your friends. My friends don't leave jars full of paper. Maybe it's from book club?" He shrugged, nonchalant, and went back to scrolling. I let it go, though the jar stayed on the counter, its presence oddly heavy for something so small. That evening, curiosity won. I twisted the lid off, and tipped the jar upside down. Dozens of tiny papers spilled onto the countertop, each one marked with careful handwriting. The first note I unfolded read, "The way you laugh in the mornings." I frowned and opened another. "Your hair catching the sunlight." The third one stopped me cold. "The corner table at Cafe Verona. 2 lattes. A shared croissant." I hadn't been to Cafe Verona in years. By the time I'd opened 5 more, my hands were trembling. The notes weren't about me. I stuffed them back into the jar, screwed the lid on, and shoved it into the pantry behind a bag of flour. The next morning, I noticed he'd started wearing a new watch. Sleek, minimalistic, with a tan leather strap. It was the kind of accessory he'd usually scoff at. "Nice watch," I said casually. "New." He looked up from his cereal, his expression blank for a moment before his face brightened. "Oh yeah, got it on sale. Thought I'd give it a try. Looks expensive for a sale." "Not really," he said, glancing back at his phone. I let it drop, though the watch caught the light whenever he moved his hand. A reminder of questions I couldn't ask. Over the next few days, the notes in the jar lingered at the edges of my thoughts, like shadows in my peripheral vision. I began to notice other things. He was leaving earlier for work, coming home later, his explanations vague but practiced. One evening, when he was out grabbing drinks with colleagues, I went back to the pantry. The jar was gone. I searched the entire kitchen, pulling open drawers and cupboards, but it had disappeared completely. My chest tightened. When he got home, I was waiting in the living room. "Where's the jar?" He froze in the doorway, his keys halfway to the hook on the wall. "What jar?" "The one with the notes." He blinked, then smiled. "Oh, that? I tossed it. Figured it was junk." "You didn't even ask." "It was just scraps of paper," he said, his tone a little too light. "What's the big deal?" The ease of his dismissal only deepened the knot in my stomach. The following Saturday, I saw him slip out of the house with the watch on his wrist and an unfamiliar jacket over his arm. I waited until he was gone, then called Cafe Verona. "Hi," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was wondering, do you have a reservation under the name Paul?" The woman on the other end of the line sounded cheerful, oblivious. "Yes, for 2 people at 1 this afternoon." My heart sank. "Thank you," I murmured and hung up. I arrived at the cafe 10 minutes after 1. His car was parked outside, and through the window, I saw him sitting at a corner table, a latte in front of him. He was smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years. Across from him sat a woman I didn't recognize. Her hair was loose, tumbling over her shoulders, and she laughed at something he said, the sound clear and bright. The same table. 2 lattes. No croissant this time. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. That evening, when he came home, he kissed me on the cheek and asked what was for dinner. I stared at him for a long moment before walking to the bedroom. I didn't confront him. Instead, I began packing a suitcase. "What's going on?" he asked when he came into the room. "I saw you today," I said quietly. His face paled. "You don't understand." "I don't need to," I interrupted. "I've seen enough." He tried to explain, words tumbling over each other. How it didn't mean anything, how it was a mistake, how he was confused. I didn't listen. By the time I zipped the suitcase shut, he was sitting on the bed, his head in his hands. "You could have just told me," I said softly. "You didn't have to leave a jar of lies in the kitchen." He looked up, his eyes wide and searching, but I was already at the door. I stayed with a friend that night, and by the time I came back for the rest of my things, he was gone. Months later, I saw the woman from Cafe Verona in the park. She was sitting on a bench, a yellow jar in her hands. She pulled out a note, read it, and smiled. I kept walking, the sunlight warm on my face, the weight of his secrets no longer mine to carry. It wasn't the kind of call I usually got. As a freelance cleaner, my jobs were routine. Clearing out hoarder homes, scrubbing grime from rental properties, sometimes tackling places where the tenants had left more than just a mess behind. But this client's voice was sharp and urgent, with a note of something I couldn't quite place. "I need you to come right away," he said. "Tonight." "Emergency cleaning isn't cheap," I warned him, already picturing the overtime surcharge. "Price doesn't matter," he snapped. Then, after a pause, I'll pay double. Just come now. The address he gave me was 30 miles outside of town, a stretch of highway that led to nowhere but abandoned barns and empty fields. I hesitated, but double was double, and I could use the money. When I arrived, the house looked normal enough. A two-story colonial with peeling paint and sagging shutters, but nothing unusual for a job in the middle of nowhere. The driveway was overgrown, and the porch light flickered weakly as I stepped out of my car. The client was waiting at the door. He was pale, his eyes darting behind me as if he expected someone else to pull up. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice flat now. He led me inside without another word. The air hit me first. It was heavy, damp, carrying a faint but undeniable smell of something rotten. Not food or garbage, but earthy, like wet soil mixed with decay. "What exactly needs cleaning?" I asked, trying not to gag. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured toward a doorway at the end of the hall. "Downstairs," he said. "The basement." Basements were always the worst. I braced myself for mildew, cobwebs, maybe even mold, but as I descended the stairs, I realized the smell wasn't coming from something natural. It was colder down there, unnaturally so, and the smell grew sharper with every step. The basement was dimly lit by a single, buzzing bulb. At the center of the floor was a tarp. It was large, too large. Whatever was underneath it was oddly shaped, bulging in places where it shouldn't. The man stood at the top of the stairs, his shadow stretching down toward me. "Just get rid of it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to climb back up the stairs and drive as far away from that house as possible. But I'd already come this far, and the money was good. I reached for the tarp. The thing underneath was covered in dirt. Not clean, loose soil, but chunks of damp earth that clung to what looked like twisted roots. The smell hit me again, stronger now, and I had to step back, gagging. "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. The man didn't answer. I peeled back more of the tarp, revealing what lay beneath. At first, I thought it was a body. It had the shape of one. A torso, limbs, but the skin was wrong, pale and slick, like something left too long in water. The arms and legs were impossibly long, each joint bent the wrong way, and the face, if you could call it that, was featureless, with a smooth surface where the eyes and mouth should have been. I staggered back, while rising in my throat. "What the hell is this?" I shouted. The man's shadow shifted, and when I turned to look, he was no longer at the top of the stairs. "Hello?" No response. The silence pressed in, thicker than the smell. The bulb above me flickered, casting the basement into momentary darkness. When it came back on, the tarp was empty. My heart stopped. I spun around, scanning the room, but it was gone. The thing. It wasn't under the tarp anymore. The smell intensified, filling the room like a suffocating fog. And then I heard it. A faint, wet sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. I backed toward the stairs, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The noise grew louder, closer, and I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of the room. The thing unfolded itself from the shadows, its limbs stretching impossibly long as it pulled itself upright. It tilted its head toward me, and even without eyes, I knew it was watching. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. The man was gone. The house was silent except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I grabbed my keys and sprinted for the door, but as I reached for the handle, I felt it. A hand. Not human. Cold and wet, its fingers curling around my wrist. I don't remember getting to my car. I don't remember driving home. But when I woke up the next morning, there was dirt under my nails and a single root clinging to the cuff of my sleeve. I burned my clothes, scrubbed my skin raw, but I can't get rid of the smell. And sometimes, when the house is quiet, I hear it. That faint, wet dragging sound. It's getting closer. I had never thought much about the mailbox at the end of the street. It stood there, unassuming, among the row of identical black mailboxes, its numbers half faded and the paint peeling from years of neglect. I didn't even know who it belonged to. The house it was attached to had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. Just an empty husk of a building hidden behind overgrown hedges. Sometimes, kids from the neighborhood dared each other to sneak into the yard or tap on the windows, but no one ever stayed for long. The first time I noticed something strange, it was purely by accident. I was walking home late, my breath clouding the air in the cool night, when I saw the lid of the mailbox slam shut. It was quick, so sudden that I stopped in my tracks. There was no wind, no one around, but the mailbox was definitely moving, creaking faintly as it settled back into stillness. Curiosity got the better of me, as it often does. I walked closer, cautiously peering at the battered surface. At first, it looked empty, but when I leaned in further, I saw something tucked inside. A single envelope. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the edges curling like it had been sitting there for years. My name was written on the front in delicate, looping handwriting. I stood there for what felt like hours, the cold biting at my fingers as I stared at the envelope. No one knew I walked this route home. No one knew I'd stop by this mailbox. It didn't make sense. I should have left it alone. I should have turned around and walked home without a second thought. But instead, I reached inside and pulled the envelope free. The paper felt dry and fragile in my hands. The seal was already broken, and when I opened it, I found a single sheet of lined paper folded neatly in half. The handwriting was the same, small and deliberate, filling the page with an unsettling precision. "You are invited." That was all it said. No details, no explanation, just those 3 words. My stomach tightened as I folded the note back into the envelope and stuffed it into my pocket. The street felt darker than it had before, the shadows heavier, stretching farther than they should have. I didn't sleep that night. The words replayed in my head, looping endlessly like a broken record. Invited to what? And by whom? By the time the first light of dawn crept through my blinds, I had convinced myself it was some kind of prank, someone messing with me. It was the only explanation that made sense. I avoided the mailbox for the rest of the week, but every night, when I passed it on my walk home, I felt its presence like a weight in the corner of my vision. It seemed darker somehow, as if the shadows around it had thickened. And then, one evening, there was another envelope. This time, I didn't even hesitate. I yanked it from the mailbox, my heart pounding, and opened it on the spot. "You've been chosen." The words were colder now, more direct. They settled in my chest like ice, and I didn't even bother folding the paper. I shoved it into my bag and walked home faster than I ever had before. The notes kept coming. Every night, a new envelope, always addressed to me, always waiting in that same decrepit mailbox. The messages became more specific. They started mentioning things I hadn't told anyone, places I'd been, conversations I'd had, even the time I'd accidentally knocked over a glass at a bar and lied about it being someone else's fault. "We know what you did. Your time is coming. Don't make us wait." I tried ignoring them, but they didn't stop. When I skipped my usual route home, I found one taped to my apartment door. When I tried throwing them away, new ones appeared in my bag, my jacket pocket, even under my pillow. Then came the night I found the key. It was waiting for me in the mailbox, tied to an envelope with a piece of frayed string. The key was old, iron, its surface pitted with rust. It felt heavy in my hand, colder than it should have been. This time, the note inside was longer. "You've been patient. Now it's time to come inside. Use the key. We're waiting." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't want to know what they meant. I didn't want to understand. But the key weighed in my hand like a challenge, daring me to see this through. I walked to the abandoned house before I could talk myself out of it. The air felt different as I approached, thicker, heavier, almost alive. The hedges parted more easily than I expected, and the path to the door seemed clearer than it had any right to be. The key fit perfectly. The door swung open with a creak, revealing a hallway that stretched farther than it should have. The air inside smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic. I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat as the door clicked shut behind me. The house was wrong. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, as though they were breathing. The light was dim and sourceless, casting shadows that moved when I wasn't looking directly at them. The hallway twisted and turned, its angles sharper than they should have been, leading me deeper into the heart of the house. I didn't choose my direction. The house seemed to guide me, each step pulling me towards something unseen. Eventually, I reached a room. It was empty, except for a single chair in the center and a mirror on the far wall. The mirror's surface rippled faintly, like water disturbed by a pebble. As I stepped closer, my reflection didn't move. It stayed perfectly still, watching me with wide, unblinking eyes. "You came," it said. The voice wasn't mine. The reflection smiled, a slow, deliberate expression that sent chills down my spine. "You're one of us now," it continued, its tone soft and almost kind. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. My limbs felt heavy, rooted in place. The reflection reached out a hand, pressing it against the glass. "Don't worry," it whispered. "We've been waiting for you." The last thing I remember is the sound of shattering glass. When I woke up, I was outside the house, the key still clutched in my hand. The mailbox was gone, and the house looked more decayed than ever, as if it had been abandoned for decades. But I know better. It's still waiting, and so am I. When I was 7, my mother told me not to play in the fields behind our house. "The earth isn't kind there," she'd said, her voice low and serious, as though the soil could hear her. I didn't understand at the time, but something in the way her eyes darted to the window as she spoke left an impression on me. I avoided the fields for years, even when my friends teased me about being scared. It wasn't until I was older, long after my mother had passed and the house had become mine, that I began to notice how wrong those fields truly were. The land stretched flat and barren, bordered by a dark line of pines that swayed even on windless days. Nothing grew there, not even weeds. The soil was a dull gray, cracked like old skin, and it smelled faintly metallic, as if the earth itself had rusted. The only thing that ever broke the monotony of that lifeless expanse was a peculiar mound that rose in the center of the field, about the size of a small car. The mound had always been there, as far as I could remember. It wasn't natural. Its shape was too precise, the edges too steep, but no one in town ever spoke about it. When I asked my father once, years ago, he'd only shaken his head. "It's better left alone," he said, his voice curt. I didn't listen. I don't know what drew me out there that first night. Curiosity, maybe, or some unspoken pull that had been building since childhood. The field seemed to hum under the moonlight, the air thick and heavy as I stepped onto the cracked soil. My boots left no prints behind. As I approached the mound, I saw that it was covered in strange carvings. They weren't words or symbols I recognized, just lines and grooves that seemed to twist and spiral in ways that hurt to look at. The closer I got, the more I felt it. A low vibration beneath my feet, faint but insistent, like the heartbeat of something enormous buried deep below. The air grew colder, sharp enough to sting my skin. My breath plumed out in front of me, and for the first time, I felt truly afraid. I should have turned back. Instead, I reached out and touched the mound. The vibration surged the moment my fingers brushed the surface, rolling up my arm and into my chest. The grooves on the mound began to glow faintly, a sickly green light that pulsed in time with the vibration. The light spilled over the field, illuminating the cracked soil and the dark line of trees in the distance. And then I heard it. A voice, not in my ears, but in my mind. It spoke in a language I didn't understand, each word slicing through my thoughts like a knife. The sound of it made my knees buckle, and I clutched my head, trying to drown it out. The voice didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like my skull would split. I stumbled back, my hands shaking, and the moment I broke contact with the mound, the light vanished. The field fell silent again, the vibration gone as though it had never been. I ran back to the house, locking every door and window behind me. The voice still echoed faintly in my mind, its cadence looping like a song I couldn't forget. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the mound was closer. It had moved at least 20 feet, though there were no signs of disturbance in the soil. The carvings seemed deeper now, the grooves sharp enough to cast shadows even in the weak morning light. I told myself it wasn't possible. Things like that didn't move, not on their own. But no matter how many times I walked the perimeter of the field, measuring the distance to the house, the mound stayed where it was, closer than it had been before. That night, I heard the voice again. It didn't come from the field this time. It came from inside the house. At first, it was faint, just a whisper threading through the creaks of the old floorboards. But as the hours dragged on, it grew louder, the words pressing against my thoughts like claws. When I looked out the window, the mound was even closer. By the third night, it was at the edge of the yard. I tried to call someone, anyone, but every number I dialed brought the same response. Static, broken by faint whispers that sounded almost familiar. The lights in the house flickered constantly, and the air smelled faintly of earth and metal. The voice no longer waited for nightfall. It spoke to me constantly, a relentless stream of words that I couldn't understand but couldn't ignore. I stopped eating, stopped sleeping. My reflection in the mirror looked wrong, my skin pale and stretched, my eyes too wide. The mound reached the house on the fourth night. It stood just outside the front door, taller than it had been before. The carvings now glowed constantly, casting shifting patterns of green light across the walls. The vibration was so strong I could feel it in my teeth, the rhythm matching the pounding of my heart. The voice was inside me now. It didn't whisper anymore. It shouted, filling every corner of my mind with its impossible language. I don't remember opening the door. I don't remember stepping outside, but I remember standing before the mound, my hands trembling as I reached for it again. This time, when my fingers touched the surface, the world fell away. The sky above me turned black, the stars swallowed by an endless void. The ground beneath my feet dissolved, leaving me suspended in a sea of nothingness. The carvings on the mound stretched and twisted, forming shapes I couldn't comprehend. And in the center of it all, something moved. It was massive, its form shifting and fluid, like smoke given weight. Its eyes, if they were eyes, gleamed with a light that burned to look at. The voice spoke again, and this time, I understood. It wasn't offering me a choice. It never had been. When I woke, the field was gone. The house stood in the center of an endless plain, the sky above it gray and churning. The mound remained, larger now, its carvings spreading across the cracked soil like veins. The voice is quiet, but I can still feel it, deep in my bones. It's waiting for me to call someone else. The invitation arrived on a Thursday, tucked between the usual clutter of bills and glossy flyers. It was handwritten on thick, creamy paper that felt expensive, the kind of stationery you associate with weddings or charity galas. The ink shimmered faintly, a dark gold that shifted under the light. "You are cordially invited," it read, "to the midnight gathering. Tomorrow, follow the music." There was no return address, no name, nothing else to suggest who had sent it or why. The envelope didn't even have my name on it. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if it was a prank or a mistake. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate. Every loop and flourish seemed to have been drawn with care. That night, I left it on the kitchen table, intending to throw it away in the morning. But I dreamed of music. Not the kind you hear in your daily life. No guitars or pianos, no melodies you could hum along to. This music was strange, alive, each note thrumming with an urgency that sent chills down my spine. It twisted and turned like a voice speaking a language I didn't understand, beckoning me forward. When I woke, the invitation wasn't on the table anymore. It was on my pillow, the words glowing faintly in the dim light of my bedroom. I didn't remember putting it there. All day, I tried to ignore it. I went to work, ran errands, made polite conversation with a neighbor. But the music from my dream lingered, humming faintly at the edges of my thoughts. By the time the sun began to set, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn toward something, a thread pulling tight around my chest. That's when I heard it. Faint at first, just a whisper on the evening breeze. A single, lilting note that stretched impossibly long before fading into silence. Then another, lower this time, followed by a cascade of sounds that felt like water spilling over rocks. I should have stayed home. I should have shut the windows, turned on the TV, and drowned it out. Instead, I stepped outside. The music wasn't coming from one direction. It surrounded me, weaving between the trees, seeping through the cracks in the pavement. The air felt heavier as I followed it, a faint warmth pressing against my skin, urging me forward. I don't know how long I walked. Time felt strange, slipping away in uneven stretches. The streets I knew blurred into unfamiliar paths, buildings and landmarks folding into one another until the town I'd lived in for years was unrecognizable. And then I saw them. Figures in the distance, silhouettes swaying gently in rhythm with the music. They were dressed in dark, flowing robes, their faces obscured by masks, some smooth and featureless, others intricately carved with strange, shifting patterns. One of them turned toward me. I froze, my breath catching. The mask was blank, white as bone, but I could feel their gaze beneath it, sharp and deliberate. They raised a hand, and the music surged, a crescendo of sound that wrapped around me like a net. "You're late," they said. Their voice was soft, almost amused, but it cut through the music like a blade. I started, but they didn't let me finish. "Come," they said, and turned away. The others began moving, their robes billowing as they walked toward the forest ahead. The music grew louder, more insistent, and I found myself following them without understanding why. The forest was alive with light. Lanterns hanging from branches, their flames flickering in colors I'd never seen before. The trees swayed gently, though there was no wind, and the ground beneath my feet felt soft, almost warm. At the center of the clearing stood a table. It was long and narrow, draped in a dark cloth that shimmered like oil. The figures gathered around it, their movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. On the table was a single object, a large, ornate mirror. Its frame was wrought from black metal, twisting and curling like vines. The glass wasn't reflective. It was dark, its surface rippling faintly, as though something moved within it. "Step forward," one of them said. The others turned to me, their masked faces expressionless but expectant. "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The gathering," they replied, as though that explained everything. Before I could respond, the music shifted. It was no longer beautiful or mesmerizing. It was sharp, discordant, digging into my chest like claws. The mirror began to glow, faint shapes swirling within its depths. For a moment, I thought I saw myself reflected there. Then the image twisted, my features warping into something unrecognizable. "You've been called," another voice said, softer this time, almost gentle. I felt the pull again, stronger now, like a rope tightening around my ribs. The figures stepped back, leaving a clear path to the table. "Look," they said. I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, to push through the trees and never look back. But my feet moved on their own, carrying me forward until I was standing in front of the mirror. The surface stilled, and then I saw it. Not my reflection, but something behind me. A shadow, tall and thin, its form flickering like smoke. Its hand was resting on my shoulder, though I couldn't feel it. The figures began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic, blending seamlessly with the music. The shadow's grip tightened, and the world around me seemed to blur, the forest dissolving into darkness. The last thing I heard before everything went silent was the voice from the dream. "You are here." I woke up in my bed. The invitation was gone, but the music was still there, faint and constant, threading its way through the quiet of my apartment. And when I look in the mirror now, I'm never alone. I had been house-sitting before, but never for a place like the Werner estate. My friend Kate was the usual caretaker, but an emergency called her out of town, and she asked if I could step in for the weekend. "It's easy," she'd said over the phone. "Feed the cat, water the plants. That's it. And trust me, it's gorgeous out there." Like stepping into a Gothic novel. She wasn't exaggerating. The estate sat at the edge of a dense forest, its sprawling grounds dotted with overgrown gardens and ancient statues half swallowed by moss. The house itself was massive, with ivy curling up its stone facade and tall, narrow windows that gleamed in the afternoon light. When I pulled up the driveway, it felt like I was crossing some invisible threshold into another time. Kate had left a key under the mat, along with a note that read, "Welcome. Food's in the fridge. Don't mind the cat if she's a little shy. Oh, and don't go into the east wing. It's being renovated. Have fun." The interior of the house was even more stunning than the outside. polished wood floors, vaulted ceilings, and hallways that seemed to stretch forever. The air carried the faint scent of cedar and lavender, as though the house had been frozen in a memory. I found the cat, a small black thing with luminous green eyes, perched on the armrest of a chair in the library. She stared at me for a moment before slipping out of the room, her footsteps so silent they may as well not have existed. The first night passed uneventfully. I wandered through the house, marveling at its grandeur, and settled in the living room with a book. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, a sound that was oddly soothing. By midnight, I was in bed, drifting into a deep, dreamless sleep. The second day felt different. It wasn't anything obvious, just small things that prickled at the edges of my awareness. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you should hold your breath. The cat didn't come out to greet me, though I caught glimpses of her slipping in and out of rooms as if she were following some secret path. As evening fell, the house seemed to change. Shadows deepened in ways that felt unnatural, pooling in corners and stretching across the walls like dark veins. The air grew heavier, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. I told myself it was the house's age. Old buildings had a way of holding on to their history, and this one had probably seen generations of lives pass through its walls. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it for the first time. A faint knocking sound, slow and deliberate. It came from somewhere in the house, too soft to pinpoint. I sat up, listening, my pulse quickening with each knock. After a minute, it stopped, leaving the silence even louder. The next morning, I called Kate. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Is there any chance someone else is supposed to be here? A groundskeeper or something?" "No, just you," she replied. "Why?" "Nothing," I said quickly. "Just thought I heard something last night." She hesitated. "Well, the house makes noises. It's old. You're probably just not used to it." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and changed the subject. The knocking came again that night, louder this time. I followed it, clutching my phone like a lifeline. It led me down the main hallway, past the grand staircase, and toward the east wing, the part Kate had told me to avoid. The door to the east wing was closed, but the knocking came from behind it, steady and insistent. My hand hovered over the doorknob, my breath shallow. Then it stopped. I waited, my heart hammering, but the silence stretched on. I backed away slowly and returned to my room, locking the door behind me. Sleep didn't come easily. By the third day, I was exhausted. The cat seemed more skittish than usual, darting from room to room as though she was avoiding something. I tried to distract myself with chores, but the sense of unease was suffocating. In the afternoon, I decided to water the plants in the greenhouse, hoping the sunlight would calm my nerves. As I stepped inside, I froze. The glass panes were fogged from the humidity, but someone had drawn symbols in the condensation. They were crude and uneven, spirals and jagged lines that seemed to writhe as I stared at them. I ran back to the house and called Kate again. "There's something wrong with this place," I blurted out. "I keep hearing noises and It's just the house," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "Don't overthink it. You'll be fine." Before I could argue, she hung up. That night, the knocking turned into pounding. It came from the east wing, shaking the walls. The cat hissed and darted under the bed as I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the sound. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the windows. When I reached the door to the east wing, it was ajar. I pushed it open, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. The air was colder here, and the walls were lined with faded portraits whose eyes seemed to follow me. At the end of the hall was another door, this one smaller, with a lock that had been broken. Inside, the room was empty except for a single chair facing the wall. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing layers of blackened wood underneath. As I stepped closer, I noticed something carved into the wall above the chair, the same symbols I'd seen in the greenhouse. And then I saw it. A figure stood in the corner, its back to me. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me, even without eyes. I ran. I don't remember how I got back to my room, but when I locked the door, the cat was gone. The pounding stopped, replaced by a low, guttural sound that echoed through the house. I didn't sleep. I didn't dare close my eyes. By morning, I was gone. I left the key on the kitchen counter and drove until the Werner estate was nothing more than a memory in my rearview mirror. Kate hasn't answered my calls since. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear knocking again, soft and distant, like a reminder that I left something behind. Or maybe that something followed me. I didn't mean to take the wrong train. It was late, and the station was nearly empty. Just me and a flickering overhead light that buzzed like an angry wasp. I was tired from a long day, my head pounding with the fluorescent glare of office screens and the dull throb of exhaustion. When the train pulled up, I stepped on without looking at the route number. I realized my mistake 2 stops later. The usual landmarks outside the window, the brightly lit convenience store, the sprawling apartment complex, the familiar graffiti on the brick wall, were gone. In their place were shadows, endless, unbroken stretches of dark shapes that seemed to ripple, though there was no wind. I glanced around the car. It was empty except for a man sitting at the far end, dressed in a black coat and a hat that cast his face in shadow. He was unnaturally still, his hands resting on his knees, his head tilted ever so slightly toward the window. I told myself it wasn't strange, that late-night commuters often sat like that, lost in their thoughts. But there was something about his stillness that felt deliberate, as if he were waiting for something. The train slowed, and I looked out the window, expecting to see another platform. But there wasn't one, just more shadows, deeper now, as if the train had descended into the earth. The man shifted. Not much, just a slight turn of his head, but it was enough to make me look away. "Excuse me," I said, my voice too loud in the quiet car. "Do you know where this train is headed?" He didn't respond. I repeated the question, but he remained silent, unmoving. I stood and walked toward the door that connected the cars, thinking I'd find a conductor or another passenger. But when I pulled the door open, the next car was empty too, and the next, and the next. Each car was identical. Worn red seats, dingy overhead lights, a faint smell of metal and grease. No people, no sounds except for the faint hum of the train as it moved forward. When I turned back, the man was no longer sitting. He was standing in the aisle of the first car, his back to me. He hadn't moved while I was walking, but there he was, closer now. "Hey," I called, my voice shaking slightly. "Where is this train going?" He didn't answer. He just tilted his head, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a shiver down my spine. The lights flickered, and for a split second, the shadows outside the windows seemed to press against the glass, their shapes shifting like living things. I ran. I sprinted through the cars, my heart pounding, my breath ragged. No matter how far I went, every car was the same. An endless loop of empty seats and buzzing lights. The train felt longer than it should have been, impossibly long, like it was stretching as I moved. I stopped in the middle of a car, gripping the back of a seat to steady myself. The shadows outside were closer now, almost brushing against the glass. And then I realized they weren't shadows. They were hands. Dozens, maybe hundreds, pressed against the windows, their fingers long and spindly, their palms smeared as if trying to force their way inside. Behind me, the door creaked open. I didn't need to look to know who it was. The lights dimmed, and the train slowed again. This time, it stopped completely, the hum of the engine fading into silence. I turned slowly, my body trembling. The man in the black coat was standing in the doorway, his hat obscuring his face, his body too tall, too thin. He didn't move, but I could feel him watching me, feel the weight of his presence like a hand on my chest. The doors hissed open, and cold air rushed in. Outside was not a station. It was a void, black and endless, with a ground that shimmered like wet obsidian. The hands were there, too, emerging from the dark, clawing at the edges of the doorway. "You shouldn't have boarded," the man said. His voice was hollow, like wind through an empty tunnel. I made a mistake," I stammered, backing away. "There are no mistakes here," he said. The hands reached for me, their movements jerky and unnatural. I screamed and scrambled to the other end of the car, but there was nowhere to go. The man stepped closer, and for the first time, I saw his face. It wasn't a face at all. It was a smooth, featureless surface, pale and glossy, like porcelain. "You ride until it's over," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. The train jolted forward, and I fell to the floor. The doors slammed shut, the hands retreating as the void outside disappeared. When I looked up, the man was gone. The train didn't stop again. For hours or days or maybe longer, I sat in the same seat, staring at the shadows outside. The cars remained empty, the lights flickering in an unsteady rhythm. I tried the emergency button. It didn't work. I tried breaking a window. It didn't even crack. And then, finally, the train slowed. It stopped at a station I didn't recognize, one that didn't look like any station I'd ever seen. The platform was empty, the air thick and still. The doors opened. I didn't move, but as I sat there, something stepped onto the train. It wasn't the man in the coat. It was something else, something worse, and it smiled. I was drawn to the small antique shop for reasons I couldn't quite name. It sat at the corner of a quiet street, its dusty windows filled with mismatched trinkets, wooden masks, tarnished jewelry, clocks with hands frozen mid-tick. It was the kind of place you walked past without much thought. Yet that day, I found myself stepping inside. The shop smelled like old paper and forgotten places, a mix of history and neglect. The faint chime of a bell announced my arrival, but no one appeared to greet me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the crowded shelves. No answer. The shop felt impossibly large, its aisles winding and narrow, lined with objects that seemed to lean closer the further I walked. My fingers brushed over the edge of a music box, the smooth glass of an oil lamp, a stack of yellowed books with spines too brittle to open. Then I saw it. Tucked in a corner, half hidden beneath a faded tapestry, was a mirror. It wasn't particularly ornate, just a simple oval frame of dark wood, its surface slightly warped as though it had been left in the sun too long. What caught my attention wasn't the mirror itself, but the way it reflected the room. It was wrong. The shelves behind me were twisted in the glass, their edges bending like they were being pulled into the reflection. Objects I didn't recognize sat among the clutter, things that hadn't been there a moment ago. A doll with too many fingers, a clock with no face, and in the center of the mirror, just over my shoulder, stood a figure. It wasn't clear at first, just a vague shape, tall and indistinct, its edges shifting like smoke. My breath caught, and I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone behind me. There was no one. I looked back at the mirror. The figure was closer now. I stepped back instinctively, my pulse quickening. My reflection didn't move. It stayed frozen, watching me, its face eerily calm while mine was wide-eyed and trembling. "Can I help you?" The voice startled me, and I spun around to see a man standing at the end of the aisle. He was older, with sharp features and a faint air of impatience, as though my presence in his shop were more nuisance than opportunity. "I was just looking," I managed, my heart still racing. His gaze flicked to the mirror behind me, and for a split second, his expression changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but something in his eyes shifted. Worry, perhaps, or recognition. "That one's not for sale," he said quickly, stepping forward. "I wasn't going to buy it," I said, my voice quieter now. My words trailed off. I didn't know how to explain what I'd seen, or why I couldn't look away. The man positioned himself between me and the mirror, his frame blocking the reflection entirely. "You should leave," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. I left without another word, the air in the shop feeling heavier with every step. That night, I couldn't shake the memory of the mirror, the figure, the way my reflection hadn't moved. The unease lingered, curling around my thoughts like smoke, until sleep finally pulled me under. When I woke, the mirror was in my bedroom. It leaned against the far wall, its wooden frame untouched by the dust that had settled on everything else. The warped glass caught the faint glow of the moonlight, twisting it into strange, jagged patterns on the floor. I sat up slowly, my chest tightening. I hadn't brought it here. I hadn't touched it. The figure was in the glass again, watching me. It was clearer now, taller than before, its form more defined. I could see its hands, long and thin, resting against the inside of the mirror as though it were pressing against a pane of glass. It tilted its head, the movement unnatural and jerky, like a puppet pulled by unseen strings. I wanted to look away, to scream, to run. Instead, I stood and walked toward it. The air around the mirror felt colder, heavier, and the closer I got, the louder the room seemed to hum. It wasn't a noise so much as a sensation, vibrating through my bones. The figure in the mirror leaned forward. Its face was almost visible now, just on the edge of recognition, like something I'd glimpsed in a dream and forgotten. I reached out, my fingers brushing the wooden frame. The glass rippled. Before I could pull away, a hand shot out of the mirror. It grabbed my wrist, its grip ice cold and impossibly strong. The skin was pale and stretched too tightly over the bones, the fingers unnaturally long. I screamed, my free hand clawing at the frame as the mirror began to pull me in. The world around me bent and twisted, the hum rising into a deafening roar. The edges of my vision blurred, and I felt myself slipping, the room dissolving into darkness. Then everything stopped. I woke on the floor of my bedroom, gasping for air. The mirror was gone, but the shadows on the walls moved in ways they shouldn't, and my reflection, faintly visible in the glass of the window, wasn't my own. It was a week before the wedding when the invitations started to disappear. At first, it seemed like a mistake. A misplaced stack, a gust of wind on the porch. We'd spent months addressing each envelope by hand, sealing them with wax, and pressing the stamp down with care. I'd checked the list twice, even thrice, to be sure. But by the next morning, half the invitations were gone. Ellie, my fiancée, was the first to notice. "You didn't move them?" she asked, her brow furrowing as she sifted through the pile. "No," I said, leaning against the counter. "Maybe you took them upstairs?" I didn't. The thought trailed off into silence, settling between us like dust. The invitations weren't upstairs. They weren't anywhere. And when we checked the addresses on the guest list, no one who was supposed to receive them had. The disappearances continued, not just the invitations but other things too. Small, innocuous items we barely noticed at first. The pen I used to jot down last-minute notes. The ribbon Ellie bought for the flower arrangements. A single cufflink from the set I'd laid out for the ceremony. Then there were the photographs. We'd taken dozens of pictures in the past year. At the park, in the garden, Ellie laughing with a glass of wine. One by one, the images began to fade, their colors leaching out until only faint outlines remained. By the time we noticed, some were already gone, the frames holding nothing but blank, glossy paper. Ellie joked about it at first, nervously brushing it off as pre-wedding jitters. "Maybe the house is just nervous too," she said, forcing a laugh. But I could see the unease creeping into her eyes, the way she avoided the mirror in the hallway or the attic stairs at night. It wasn't until 3 days before the wedding that I found the door. We lived in a modest farmhouse, old but sturdy, with a creak in the floorboards that felt almost comforting. I'd walked through every inch of it 100 times before, but this door hadn't been there yesterday. It was small, barely 5 feet tall, its wood dark and warped, with an iron handle that looked like it belonged in some ancient ruin. It was set into the wall at the far end of the basement, where the concrete gave way to earth. Ellie was out running errands when I discovered it. I called her, but my phone went straight to voicemail. The hum of the washer and dryer filled the space as I stood there, staring. I should have waited. Instead, I reached for the handle. The door opened with a sound like air being sucked from the room, and the light from the basement flickered as though the shadows beyond it had taken a breath. Beyond the door was not another room, but a space that shouldn't have existed, a tunnel that stretched downward, its walls lined with jagged stone that glistened faintly in the dim glow of my phone's flashlight. The air smelled of earth and something sweet, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun. I stepped inside. The tunnel felt alive, its walls shifting subtly as though breathing. My footsteps were muffled by the dirt beneath me, and the further I walked, the more the sound of the house above faded. The walls narrowed until I had to turn sideways, the cold stone pressing against my chest. And then I saw it. The first of the invitations. It lay on the ground, its edges frayed, its wax seal cracked. Next to it was another, and another. The farther I went, the more there were, scattered like breadcrumbs leading me deeper into the earth. At the end of the tunnel, the air grew colder, and the walls opened into a cavernous space. My flashlight's beam wavered, its battery inexplicably draining, but I could still make out the shapes. They hung from the ceiling, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, figures draped in what looked like fabric, their limbs bound tightly to their sides. The fabric wasn't white. It was pale, like flesh pulled too taut, veins faintly visible beneath its surface. And their faces. The faces weren't human. Each head was long, too long, with hollow sockets where eyes should have been. Their mouths were stitched shut with fine, silver thread, and their heads turned slowly, synchronously, to face me as I stepped into the room. In the center of the cavern, a figure sat hunched over a low table. Its fingers, impossibly long and thin, delicately sorted through the invitations, stacking them into neat piles. I couldn't breathe. The figure turned its head toward me, its stitched mouth curving impossibly upward into what could only be described as a smile. It reached out and placed something on the table. My cufflink. Why? I managed to whisper, though the word felt hollow in the thick air. The figure tilted its head, its movements jerky and puppet-like, as though considering the question. It raised one hand, pointing behind me. I turned, and the figures hanging from the ceiling began to sway, their mouths straining against the silver thread. Their movements became faster, frantic, until the cavern was filled with the sound of tearing fabric and the sickening pop of breaking stitches. I ran. The tunnel seemed longer now, endless, the walls closing in around me. My flashlight died completely, leaving me in darkness so thick it felt like drowning. When I finally emerged into the basement, the door slammed shut behind me, disappearing into the wall as though it had never been there. Ellie came home an hour later, her arms full of flowers. I didn't tell her what I'd seen. The wedding went ahead as planned, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The missing invitations never turned up, and on our wedding night, as Ellie and I danced beneath the stars, I saw it. The faint outline of a figure at the edge of the forest, its face tilted upward, its stitched smile impossibly wide. When I first moved into the house, I noticed the door immediately. It wasn't supposed to be there. The house was old, an uneven mix of charm and decay. It had been on the market for over a year, and I could afford it only because no one else seemed to want it. The previous owners left in a hurry, though no one could tell me why. It's just one of those places, the realtor had said, laughing nervously. You'll love it once you settle in. The door was in the basement, tucked into the far corner behind the boiler. It was narrow, its frame slightly crooked, as though the house had tried to reject it. The wood was dark and weathered, streaked with lines that looked like claw marks. I could see no knob or keyhole, just a rusted metal latch holding it shut. When I asked the realtor about it, she hesitated, glancing at the ground before answering. "Oh, that," she said. "Probably just storage. Old houses like this always have little oddities. I wouldn't worry about it." Her voice was too bright, too rehearsed. I didn't push her further. At first, I left the door alone. It felt like something I shouldn't disturb, like the lid of an old jar sealed tight for a reason. But it lingered at the edge of my thoughts, nagging at me every time I went down to the basement. By the second week, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I brought a flashlight and tools, determined to satisfy my curiosity. The latch was stiff, but it gave way with a sharp screech. When I opened the door, all I found was darkness. The beam of my flashlight didn't reach far. The space beyond the door seemed impossibly deep, a void that swallowed the light whole. I leaned closer, squinting, and thought I saw movement, shadows shifting against shadows. The air was colder here, heavy with the faint scent of earth and iron. Something about it made my skin crawl, and I slammed the door shut, latching it again with trembling hands. That night, I dreamed of the door. It loomed larger in my mind, stretching up to the ceiling, its claw-marked surface pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat. I could hear something behind it, scraping, whispering, too faint to understand. I woke drenched in sweat, the sound still echoing in my ears. In the morning, the door was ajar. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, staring down at the narrow gap. The latch hung loose, swaying gently. I told myself it was the draft, the old hinges, anything that made sense. I went down, closed it, and bolted it shut with a piece of scrap wood. That evening, it was open again. The door became an obsession. I avoided the basement, but the door didn't care. It found ways to reach me. My dreams were filled with it, growing larger and larger until it filled the entire house. Sometimes I woke to faint sounds, scratching, like nails against wood, or the distant echo of something heavy being dragged. One morning, I found dirt on the floor of my living room. It formed a trail, faint but unmistakable, leading from the basement stairs to the edge of my bed. I started sleeping with the lights on. The house itself began to change. Doors I'd left closed were open in the morning. Windows fogged with no explanation, streaked with lines that resembled claw marks. My reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed slower, as though it was watching me more intently than it should. And always, there was the sound. It was faint at first, like the low hum of distant machinery, but it grew louder, closer. A pulsing rhythm, uneven and organic, like the heartbeat of something vast and unseen. One night, I woke to find the door at the foot of my bed. It shouldn't have been there. I'd bolted it shut in the basement, but now it loomed in my bedroom, its dark wood gleaming faintly in the moonlight. The latch hung open, the door slightly ajar. I couldn't move. The air was thick, pressing down on me, and my limbs felt like lead. The door creaked, opening wider, and for the first time, I saw what was on the other side. It wasn't darkness, not exactly. It was movement, shadows twisting and curling, folding in on themselves. Eyes blinked open in the void, dozens of them, unblinking and too bright. A hand emerged, long and pale, its fingers too many and too sharp. The hum became a roar, vibrating through my chest, and the hand reached for me. When I woke, it was morning. The door was gone, back in the basement where it belonged. But the latch was broken now, the wood splintered as though something had forced its way out. I packed my things that day, determined to leave the house behind. But the moment I opened the front door, I froze. There it was, waiting for me in the yard. The door stood upright in the grass, unattached to anything, its dark wood streaked with fresh claw marks. The latch hung loose, and the hum was louder now, resonating deep in my bones. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then, slowly, the door opened. I always hated the idea of living in an apartment with shared walls. Noise, neighbors, awkward elevator rides. I wanted none of it. But the place on Parkview Avenue seemed different. The building had a strange charm. A weathered brick exterior, ivy creeping up one side, and an almost eerie quietness despite being in the middle of the city. The landlord described it as historical and unique. But what sold me was the price. It wasn't until I moved in that I understood why it was so cheap. The first time I noticed the wall, I'd been living there for about a week. It was late, and I was putting together an IKEA shelf. My hammering echoed in the tiny space, and I suddenly felt a pang of guilt about the noise. My upstairs neighbor was probably annoyed, and the person on the other side of the wall. Wait, I hadn't met anyone on the other side of the wall. In fact, I hadn't heard anything from that apartment. No voices, no television, no muffled thumps or clinks of dishes. None of the ambient signs of life you'd expect in a place with such thin walls. Curious, I paused and pressed my ear against the drywall. Nothing. Well, not nothing. There was a faint sound. Not movement, exactly. More like a slow, rhythmic scrape, like metal dragging over stone. It unsettled me enough to put the shelf assembly on hold for the night. The scraping continued intermittently over the next few days. It wasn't constant, but it always seemed to happen late at night when the world outside my window went quiet. I didn't want to bother the landlord, so I asked the woman across the hall about it one morning as she unlocked her door. "Oh, that's probably apartment 4C, she said without looking up. "Who lives there?" I asked. Her hand froze on the doorknob, and she turned to look at me, her expression unreadable. "Nobody." It's been empty for years. I tried to laugh it off as she disappeared into her apartment, but the scraping sound grew harder to ignore after that. The idea of an empty unit making noise at night didn't sit well with me, so I decided to investigate. I waited until the next evening. Around 11 p.m., when the scraping started again, I grabbed my phone and stepped into the hallway. Apartment 4C was directly next to mine. The door was identical to mine, except the paint was peeling and the brass numbers looked older, tarnished. I knocked. The scraping stopped instantly. I felt ridiculous standing there, my knuckles poised for another knock. I leaned closer, pressing my ear to the door. Nothing. My hand was on the doorknob before I realized what I was doing. It didn't budge. I tried again, harder this time, but the door held firm. That's when I noticed it, the air. It smelled faintly metallic, sharp and cold, like a room that hadn't been opened in years. A sense of unease settled over me, and I returned to my apartment, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. That night, the scraping didn't just come from the wall. It came from the ceiling and the floor. It surrounded me, moving in slow, deliberate patterns, as if it was tracing the outline of my apartment. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I went straight to the landlord. "Apartment 4C, I said, cutting him off before he could offer me coffee. "Who lives there?" His face paled slightly, but he recovered quickly. "No one," he said too quickly. "The unit's under renovation." "Renovation?" I asked. "There's no furniture in there. No tools. Just scraping sounds every night." "I'll look into it," he said, his voice flat. But he didn't. The sounds escalated. By the end of the week, I was hearing faint whispers through the wall. Not words exactly, but the cadence of speech, like something just on the edge of understanding. And then, one night, I woke up to find the wall was different. The drywall wasn't smooth anymore. It was textured, like something had been etched into it. Lines crisscrossed the surface, forming shapes that were almost recognizable, but seemed to shift when I tried to focus on them. Panicked, I turned on every light in the apartment and grabbed my phone to call the landlord, but the call wouldn't go through. Instead, my phone buzzed with a text. "Don't open the wall." It was from an unknown number. I stared at the screen, my pulse pounding in my ears. Before I could process it, the scraping began again. Louder this time, deeper. The wall vibrated faintly under my hand. Without thinking, I grabbed the hammer I'd abandoned days ago and struck the wall. It cracked easily, as if it had been waiting for this. A piece of drywall crumbled away, revealing something underneath. Something smooth and dark, like polished stone. I hit it again, and the stone cracked, releasing a gust of air that smelled of rust and decay. And then I saw it. Behind the wall was a face. Not a human face. It was too long, too narrow. The skin stretched taut over bones that didn't make sense. Its eyes were closed, and its mouth was frozen in a half-smile that felt like mockery. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, swirling in a language I couldn't understand. I backed away as the face's eyes opened, two empty voids that seemed to pull the light out of the room. The last thing I remember before blacking out was the sound of the wall sealing itself back up, the stone knitting together like it had never been broken. When I woke up, the apartment was empty. The lines on the wall were gone, and the whispers had stopped. I moved out the next day. I don't know if the thing behind the wall is still there, or if it followed me. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of scraping, tracing the outline of my new apartment. The package arrived on a Monday, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with twine. There was no return address, no shipping label, just my name written neatly in black ink across the top. I hadn't ordered anything. No birthday was coming up, no special occasion. But the package was heavy, and something inside it shifted when I picked it up. My curiosity outweighed my caution. I brought it into the kitchen, set it on the table, and untied the twine. Inside was an old wooden box, its surface worn smooth by time, the edges chipped and scarred. It smelled faintly of cedar and something else, something sharp and metallic. There was a latch, but no lock. I hesitated for a moment, the weight of unease pressing against my ribs. Then I opened it. Inside was a mirror. It wasn't particularly large, no bigger than a sheet of notebook paper, and it was framed in the same weathered wood as the box. The glass itself was cloudy, tarnished at the edges, like an antique that had been pulled from someone's attic. And yet, when I looked into it, the reflection was perfect. Too perfect. I could see myself, my face, my kitchen, the small scuff on the wall behind me, but everything was sharper, more vivid. My eyes looked brighter, my skin smoother, as though the mirror were improving me in subtle, uncanny ways. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the glass. The reflection didn't follow. My hand froze midair. My reflection's hand stayed at its side, motionless, staring back at me. I slammed the box shut. The sound echoed through the kitchen, louder than it should have been, and the lights above flickered. I sat there for a long moment, my breath uneven, my pulse hammering in my ears. When I finally opened the box again, the mirror was gone. The inside was empty, lined with dark velvet that smelled faintly of cedar. I turned the box over, shook it, searched for a hidden compartment, but there was nothing. No mirror. I didn't sleep well that night. My dreams were fractured, filled with distorted images of my own face, smiling, staring, moving in ways I couldn't. By the time I woke, I had almost convinced myself it had all been a strange hallucination, until I found the mirror on my desk. It sat there, propped against my laptop, its frame still worn and splintered, the glass as clear and sharp as before. I didn't move. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to know if the reflection would move without me again. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I left the mirror where it was, avoiding the desk entirely, trying to convince myself that someone was playing a trick on me. Maybe a friend had slipped it inside while I wasn't looking. Maybe I'd imagined the way it moved. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint scraping sound from the living room. It was soft, rhythmic, like fingernails dragging across wood. I didn't want to get up. I didn't want to look. But the sound was relentless, growing louder, more insistent. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the living room, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The mirror was no longer on the desk. It was on the floor, leaning against the leg of the coffee table, its frame slightly tilted. The scraping stopped as soon as I entered the room. I stood there, the phone trembling in my hand, staring into the mirror. My reflection stared back. This time, it was smiling. I backed away slowly, my breath shallow, the room suddenly too small. I didn't know what to do. Calling someone felt absurd. What could I even say? That a mirror had been haunting me? That my reflection wasn't behaving? But as I turned to leave the room, the smile in the mirror widened. And then it waved. I locked the mirror in the bathroom. I shoved it into the cabinet beneath the sink, wedging it between the pipes and the cleaning supplies, and shut the door. When I woke the next morning, it was in my bed. The frame was pressed against the pillow beside me, the glass angled toward my face. I bolted upright, my pulse thundering, and threw it across the room. It hit the wall with a sickening thud, but the glass didn't break. Instead, it landed face up on the carpet, and for the first time, I saw the other side of the mirror. There was a figure standing there. It was faint, almost indistinct, its edges blurred as though it were standing just beyond a veil. But I could see the outline of its limbs, the tilt of its head, the way it seemed to press against the other side of the glass, desperate to get closer. The mirror was no longer a reflection. It was a window. I threw the box away. I buried it in the trash beneath bags of old food and broken appliances, making sure it was out of sight, out of reach. I locked the door to my apartment, closed the curtains, and unplugged every lamp in the house. But the mirror keeps finding its way back. It's in places I haven't touched, on the bookshelf, on the kitchen counter, once even inside my fridge. And every time I see it, the figure is closer. Last night, it pressed a hand against the glass. This morning, I woke with a splinter of wood embedded in my palm. The same dark, weathered wood as the mirror's frame. I don't know what it wants. I don't know what will happen when it finally steps through. But I think it's almost here.